Chapter 2307. Violet Jajuan focused his eyes and noticed that the beautiful woman was holding a violet jade in her hand. Of course, violet jades weren't rare to Juan, but Juan noticed two lines on the violet jade. Violet energy transformed into violet mist, violet rain beneath violet mist. Juan muttered in a low voice, and it was as if a bolt of lightning had flashed through his mind while rumbling and exploding, causing him to be stunned on the spot. Juan was truly too clear about these two lines. When he comprehended a trace of 9th level Tao insight in the sky clarity and mortal domain that day, these two lines had automatically floated into appearance within his mind, and these two lines just happened to contain the truth of the 7th level, 8th level, and 9th level ultimate Tao insights. But now, Juan had actually seen it in a violet jade that the beautiful woman had taken out. So how could he not be shocked? Where did you get this violet jade? Juan held the beautiful woman's jade hand and asked slightly anxiously. The beautiful woman suddenly coughed up a mouthful of black blood, and the aura of death in her eyes grew denser. She withdrew a jade slip from her spirit ring while trembling, and then she passed it to Juan and said, "There's an explanation of everything related to violet jades in here. This violet jade was obtained by the ancestor of my Sioux clan by accident, but my Sioux clan has declined more and more, and it was passed down to me in the end. But I've let down the elders of my clan and actually believed that ingrate Jiawendong causing me to fall to such an extent in the end." When she spoke up to hear, the beautiful woman's aura became even more dispirited, whereas a trace of pity flashed in Juan's eyes, and he placed his right hand on her shoulder before surging divine energy surged into her body. But this was only treating the symptoms and not the root of the problem. The poison had already entered deep into the young woman's soul, and not to mention Juan. Even an expert that ascended 9 times would probably be unable to save this woman. With the influx of divine energy, the beautiful woman's countenance became slightly rosy, yet the aura of death on her body grew denser. "Thank you, Senior. This purple jade has a mysterious origin. Back then, because of this purple jade, our Sioux clan's grand ancestors' cultivation level rose steadily. Within 100 years, he broke through to the true God realm. Within 1,000 years, he broke through to the virtual sky realm. Within 10,000 years, his cultivation level reached the 8th level of the virtual sky realm. He was unparalleled in the 6 desires heavenly region. He even founded the Sioux clan and became the overlord of the 6 desires heavenly region. Moreover, when the ancestor reached the early stage of the 8th step, his strength was extremely terrifying. Even some late-stage cultivators were no match for the ancestor. It could be said that that era was the Sioux family's most powerful era. However, my Sioux family's old ancestor mysteriously disappeared, leaving only this purple jade to be passed down. However, the strange thing is that every time the Sioux family's patriarch obtained the purple jade, he would mysteriously disappear after his cultivation reached the void sky 8 steps. This has become a mystery of the Sioux family. Due to the disappearance of the Sioux family's patriarch generation after generation, the Sioux family has completely declined. However, this purple jade has never declined and has always remained in my Sioux family until it reached my hands. Now that I'm about to die, I don't want this purple jade to be lost, so I'm giving it to Senior. If Senior thinks it's an ominous item, you can take it back to the Sioux family and let them keep it." At this point, the delicate woman slowly closed her eyes and said, "Senior, if you're interested in this purple jade, you can take it. However, Senior, please take my bones back to the Sioux family. At least, I want to return to my roots after I die." As she spoke, the delicate woman's vitality was completely cut off. Then, the woman slowly fell to the ground. Juan looked at the delicate woman who had lost her vitality with a complicated gaze. This was a woman who was infatuated, but she loved the wrong person, which led to such a tragedy in the end. Juan waved his sleeve, and the divine flame enveloped the delicate and pretty woman. Then he put her ashes into a jade jar. After doing all this, Zhuowen glanced at the purple jade in his hand. This purple jade still contained the energy of Tao insight. However, the energy of Tao insight was extremely weak now. Then he connected it to what the delicate woman said. When the Su family's ancestor obtained this purple jade, he should have relied on this purple jade to comprehend the energy of Tao insight. Through the amplification of Tao insight, this was why he was stronger than a cultivator at the 8th step of the void sky realm at the 8th step of the void sky realm at the 8th step. According to Zhuowen's conjecture, the gap between the 8th step and 8th step was quite large. However, the Su family's ancestor was able to defeat a cultivator at the 8th step. It was very likely that the Su family's ancestor's comprehension of Tao insight had attained the 8th level. Zhuowen himself had comprehended the 7th level of Tao insight, so he was relatively clear about the amplification of Tao insight. The addition of 7th level Tao insight at the 8th step of the void sky realm at the 8th step would at most be comparable to a cultivator at the 8th step of the void sky realm, and it was absolutely impossible for him to defeat a cultivator at the 8th step. But 8th level Tao insight was different. Its amplification of strength was a level higher, and it was sufficient to defeat a cultivator at the 8th step of the void sky realm. Of course, what Zhuowen was more concerned about was the mysterious disappearance of the Su family's ancestor later on. It wasn't just the Su family's ancestor. Every single patriarch of a Su family that had inherited this purple jade had mysteriously disappeared after cultivating to a certain height. Zhuowen knew that this ought to be closely related to the purple jade in his possession. More precisely speaking, it ought to be related to the energy of Tao insight within the purple jade. Moreover, Zhuowen knew that this Tao insight was the energy possessed by the Sky Tao insight. Could it be that this purple jade is related to the Sky Tao insight? When he thought up to here, Zhuowen's gaze became extremely cautious. He faintly seemed to have grasped something, yet it also seemed as if he hadn't grasped anything. Perhaps I should make a trip to the Su family if I have the chance. Zhuowen's gaze flickered. He really wanted to know why the Su family's ancestor had mysteriously disappeared now, as this was related to the key to whether he should continue comprehending the energy of Tao insight. In the beginning, Zhuowen didn't feel that there was a problem with the energy of Tao insight. After all, the energy of Tao insight was truly magical and could increase any strength in the body. But now that he heard about the Su family's ancestor, Zhuowen began to suspect the strangeness of this energy of Tao insight. In particular, the feeling that the Sky Tao insight gave him was too mysterious, and he couldn't trust the Sky Tao insight. Therefore, in order to confirm the thoughts in his heart, he needed to make a trip to the Su family. Let's leave this place first. Zhuowen stood up and took a step forward with his right foot. It was as if there was no distance in the surrounding space under his feet. Zhuowen shuttled through space after space, strolling leisurely. After taking a few hundred steps, he finally left the spatial law area. An aura of extreme vicissitudes came from the surroundings, as if everything here was passing by. Although the surrounding things were still, it gave people the feeling that they were passing by. Zhuowen felt that he was standing in a whirlpool of life that was gradually disappearing. His life seemed to be flowing away, and there was only a kind of panic and fear in his heart. Zhuowen calmed his mind and stabilized his thoughts. Then he began to carefully size up the surrounding environment. The surroundings were barren. There was no light, no water, no life, no spiritual herbs. There was only an indescribable color. It seemed to be gray and hazy, but also seemed to have a trace of a very strange color. This is the color of time. Zhuowen had such a thought for no reason. Chapter 2308. Time Crystal. It seems that I've really entered the time law area. Zhuowen looked at his surroundings and let out a light sigh. In his opinion, the law of time was superior to the law of space. Before the law of time, everyone was equal. After entering this area, Zhuowen could clearly see that his life was flowing away much faster here than in the outside world. Zhuowen found a quiet desert and took out a map from his spirit ring. There were detailed markings on the map. His gaze fell on the Time Law area and discovered that there was a Time Divine River between the Time Law area and the Space-Time Law area. The Time Law in the Time Divine River was the most terrifying. It was said that cultivators who entered the Time Divine River would lose their lifespan hundreds of millions of times faster than in the outside world. Even though Void Sky cultivators had extremely long lifespans, they wouldn't be able to last more than a few days in the Time Divine River. They would gradually grow old and eventually die of exhaustion. Unless one mastered a certain amount of Time Law and slowed down the time flow in the Time Divine River, it was almost impossible to cross the Time Divine River. Zhuowen looked around and discovered that the Time Divine River wasn't far away. The Time Law area wasn't big. There was only one space here, unlike the Space Law area, which had overlapping spaces that were densely packed like a maze. When Zhuowen arrived at the Time Divine River, he discovered that there were 5 figures sitting cross-legged on the banks of the Time Divine River. Judging from the positions of the 5 figures, they were vaguely divided into 3 factions. 2 white-robed old men sat together in one faction. Another faction had a pair of Tao companions sitting on the other side. The last person was an extremely beautiful man. At this moment, the man was gently waving his folding fan as if he didn't see the hostility in the eyes of the other 4 people. Zhuowen's arrival attracted the attention of the 5 people here. The other 4 people only glanced at Zhuowen indifferently. When they discovered that Zhuowen was only a Void Sky 7th step cultivator, they looked away without interest and ignored him. The beautiful man was still waving his folding fan. The moment he saw Zhuowen behind him, a smile appeared on his face. He walked forward and smiled at Zhuowen. "Brother Zhua, you're really extraordinary. You can actually cross the Space Law area so quickly. Brother Yao, you flatter me. If we're talking about speed, Brother Yao is much faster than me," Zhuowen said with a smile. The beautiful man in front of him was none other than Yao Xiangjuan, whom Zhuowen had met in the Quicksand family. Yao Xiangjuan shook his head and said, "Brother Zhua, you're too modest. I'm not much faster than you." "Right, where's Miss Zhu Rui?" Zhuowen suddenly asked. Yao Xiangjuan was startled, and then he smiled and said, "That little girl Zhu Rui's strength isn't enough, so I found a relatively safe space in the Space Law area and let her cultivate there in peace. After I leave, I'll take her with me." Hearing this, Zhuowen nodded, and then his gaze fell on the 4 people in front of the Divine River of Time. He said, "Why are the 5 of you sitting on the banks of the Divine River of Time? Could it be that you're waiting for something?" Besides Yao Xiangjuan's cultivation, which Zhuowen couldn't see through, he discovered that the other 4 people's cultivation wasn't bad. Among them, the 2 white-robed old men were at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step, and the couple's strength was slightly weaker. The man was at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step, and the woman was at the intermediate stage of the Void Sky 7th step. Even in the outside world, the strength of these 4 people could be considered supreme powerhouses. Now, they were actually sitting on the banks of the river. Obviously, they were waiting for something. Yao Xiangjuan smiled and said, "The Divine River of Time is about to recede, and that means that the Time Crystal will appear. Brother Zhua, what do you think we're waiting for?" Zhuowen's pupils shrank, and his gaze fell on the Divine River of Time. No wonder Yao Xiangjuan and the other 4 people were waiting on the banks of the river. It turned out that the Time Crystal contained in the river was about to recede. At that time, the Time Crystal contained in the river would appear. The Time Crystal was similar to the Space Crystal, but it was more precious and rarer than the Space Crystal. The Time Crystal was also a top-notch refining material. If the Time Crystal was refined into a divine artifact, the divine artifact would have a slight effect of freezing time. Just think about it. If your divine artifact had the ability to stop time, even if it was only for an instant, it could absolutely help you turn the situation around at a critical moment. "Brother Zhua, I know that your strength is not bad, but the other 4 people are not simple either. After the divine river of time recede, how about you and I join forces to seize the time crystal? Yao Xiangjuan suddenly transmitted his voice to Zhuowen. Zhuowen was startled. Then he glanced at Yao Xiangjuan. After pondering for a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, but I want 60% of the time crystal." Yao Xiangjuan was taken aback. Then he smiled and said, "Then it's a deal. With Brother Zhuo's strength, even if I only get 40%, it's still a profit." Zhuowen looked at Yao Xiangjuan in surprise. This guy seemed to be very confident in him. Could it be that this Yao Xiangjuan really thought that he, Zhuowen, was invincible in the world? "By the way, Brother Yao, I met your sister Yao Xiangjuan in the space law area. I heard that she snuck out. Is that true?" Zhuowen stared straight at Yao Xiangjuan and suddenly asked. Yao Xiangjuan was a little surprised. Then he became quite angry and said hatefully, "That little girl really snuck out. I already warned her not to run around." But she still didn't listen. Speaking up to here, Yao Xiangjuan cupped his fists at Zhuowen and said, "Brother Zhuo, where is your sister now? Can you give me an address?" Zhuowen shook his head and said, "I can't give you the specific address. Moreover, the last time I saw your sister was a few months ago. I don't know where she went after that." Yao Xiangjuan looked disappointed and sighed. "It's my fault for not disciplining her well. Brother Zhuo, your sister didn't cause you any trouble, did she?" "No, I don't think your sister is a simple person. It's relatively safe in the river of time and space. It won't be too late for Brother Yao to find your sister after you leave the river of time and space," Zhuowen said with a smile. "That's the only way." Yao Xiangjuan said helplessly. Whoosh! Suddenly, the ear-piercing sound of water was heard. Immediately, the river of time in front of them began to surge violently and then began to recede. The water level of the river of time on the shore kept falling and began to expose the riverbed below. Although the river water had not completely receded, Zhuowen had already seen the sparkling and translucent crystals below the riverbed through the river water. He knew that these should be time crystals. Not only Zhuowen, but Yao Xiangjuan, the 2 white-robed elders, and the pair of Tao companions also stood up and looked at the time crystal that was about to be exposed with burning gazes. Whoosh! The sound of water was heard again. This time, the water on the shore of the river of time finally receded completely, revealing the riverbed that was several feet wide. "Brother Zhuo, snatch it!" The moment the riverbed was completely exposed, Yao Xiangjuan sent a message to Zhuowen with his mind. Then his figure shot towards the riverbed at lightning speed. Chapter 2309. Zhuowen naturally rushed out immediately. The moment he rushed out, Zhuowen released his divine sense and immediately swept up many time crystals. What a powerful divine sense! Yao Xiangjuan's pupils shrank. He naturally noticed that Zhuowen had used his divine sense to sweep away many time crystals. Moreover, this sweep was much more than what they had. The other 4 people also noticed Zhuowen. Although the 4 of them were angry that Zhuowen, a mere void sky 7 steps ant, had swept away so many time crystals, they did not attack him. However, they did not attack Zhuowen. There were quite a number of time crystals here. They did not want to delay the opportunity to collect them because of such a small matter. After 10 breaths, the 6 people had plundered all the time crystals in the exposed riverbed at the edge of the divine river of time. As Zhuowen's divine sense was much stronger than the other 5 people's, he alone had obtained 1/3 of the total number of time crystals, far more than the other 5 people. Yao Xiangjuan came to Zhuowen's side and stared at the 2 white-robed elders and the couple in front of him vigilantly. He knew that the fight for the time crystals was far from over. Sure enough, after the other 4 people finished snatching the time crystals, their cold gazes landed on Zhuowen. One of the white-robed elders looked at Zhuowen sinisterly and said, "Little guy, hand over all the time crystals on you and get out of here immediately." "Wei Hua, aren't you too merciful?" Just kill this kid. Not only will the time crystals he snatched be ours, but this guy's spirit ring will also be ours. Another elder licked his lips and stared straight at Zhuowen like a hungry wolf staring at its prey. The pair of Dao companions stood silently at the side. Amongst the 6 of them, the combination of the 2 white-robed old men was undoubtedly the strongest. Although the couple also coveted the time crystals that Zhuowen had snatched, they did not want to go against the 2 white-robed elders. Therefore, they only planned to watch the show from the side. Brother Zhuo, these 2 old guys are not easy to deal with. Moreover, these 2 old guys are proficient in combination techniques. We might be at a disadvantage if we go against them. Why don't we retreat? I have 2 escape talismans on me that are enough to help us escape, Yao Xiangjuan suggested. Although Zhuowen had killed 3 temple guardians before entering the river of space-time quicksand, and one of them was a late-stage Void Sky 8 steps expert. However, although the 2 white-robed elders in front of him were also late-stage Void Sky 8 steps, each of them was stronger than the temple guardian. In addition, the 2 cooperated well and were proficient in combination techniques. He did not think that they had much of a chance of winning against these 2 white-robed elders. Brother Yao, don't worry, I'll take care of these 2 people. If you feel that it's inappropriate, you can leave first, Zhuowen said coolly. Yao Xiangjuan was stunned. He looked at Zhuowen's back with a complicated expression. He did not know where this young man got his confidence from. He actually dared to take on 2 people by himself. However, Yao Xiangjuan did not leave. Instead, he stood side by side with Zhuowen and said, Brother Zhuo, since we are allies now, I have no intention of abandoning you. Since you want to fight, I'll accompany you. Zhuowen nodded. He had a better impression of Yao Xiangjuan in his heart. Yao Xiangjuan had considered his feelings at all times. This was something that Zhuowen appreciated. Humph, let's go. They are just 2 little guys who smell like milk. Wei Hua, let's kill them together. The tall, white-robed elder snorted coldly. He took the lead and rushed towards Zhuowen. A trident had appeared in his hand at an unknown time. The moment the tall, white-robed elder rushed out, the elder named Wei Hua also rushed out and rushed towards Yao Xiangjuan. Zhuowen drew his king's sword and slashed out, engaging in a fierce battle with the tall old man. This tall elder's strength was indeed stronger than the temple guardian from before. However, Zhuowen had already advanced to the Void Sky 7th step. His strength was much stronger than before. To put it bluntly, Zhuowen did not even need to use phagocytosis to kill this tall elder. However, Zhuowen did not use his killing move. His attention fell on Yao Xiangjuan, who was not far away. This Yao Xiangjuan was quite mysterious. In addition, he had never been able to see through Yao Xiangjuan's cultivation. This made Zhuowen very curious as to whether Yao Xiangjuan was a match for Wei Hua. At the same time, he would be able to understand more about Yao Xiangjuan. Moreover, he knew from Jiao Wendong that Zhu Rui was a disciple of the 6 Desires Palace. Since Yao Xiangjuan was Zhu Rui's senior brother, he was probably also a disciple of the 6 Desires Palace. Bang! 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 Yao Xiangjuan instantly clashed with Wei Hua. Yao Xiangjuan's weapon was a divine sword that emitted an azure light. Moreover, Zhuowen found that the divine sword style was a little feminine. However, when he thought of Yao Xiangjuan's face that was even more beautiful than a woman's, it was not strange for him to have a feminine divine weapon. Wei Hua's cultivation was at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step. His strength was not weaker than the tall elder fighting Zhuowen. However, Yao Xiangjuan dealt with him with ease and did not show any signs of being at a disadvantage. Zhuowen looked deeply at Yao Xiangjuan. He thought that this Yao Xiangjuan was indeed not simple. From Yao Xiangjuan's temperament, he could see that Yao Xiangjuan's cultivation time was not much longer than Zhuowen's. However, he had this kind of battle strength. He could definitely be considered a monster. Where are you looking? You're actually distracted in battle. You're simply courting death. The tall elder who was fighting Zhuowen saw that Zhuowen's attention was on Yao Xiangjuan, who was not far away. He immediately felt that he was being looked down upon. He flew into a rage and mercilessly attacked Zhuowen with the trident in his hand. Bang! 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 In an instant, countless halberd shadows turned into a monstrous sea, setting off waves that were tens of thousands of feet high. Suddenly, Zhuowen was swept in. His Dao companions, who were standing nearby, saw the terrifying halberd moves released by the tall old man, and their expressions changed. The tall elder's move was extremely terrifying. Even if it were the two of them, they might not be able to escape unscathed if they wanted to block this move. The two of them knew that the white-clothed young man was finished. The endless halberd shadows sprinkled down and instantly drowned Zhuowen's figure. However, not long after the halberd shadows drowned Zhuowen, a terrifying sword light suddenly blasted out from the depths of the halberd shadows. Then the sword light continued to condense and turned into a huge sword dragon that whistled out. It was Zhuowen who had used the 8th move of the Tao of Destruction sword art, Sky Slashing Sword Dragon. What? This guy? The tall elder looked at the scene with some astonishment. His face quickly turned ugly. He realized that the young man in front of him was not as simple as he seemed on the surface. The young man's strength was far beyond his imagination. Bang! The tall elder suddenly blasted out the trident in his hand and hit the sword dragon. Then he groaned and retreated dozens of steps before he could barely stabilize himself. Old man, I'm not going to play with you anymore. I'll give you a chance to live. Take this move of mine. Then you only need to hand over the time crystal, and you can leave. Zhuowen held the sword in his right hand and looked down at the tall elder. The killing intent in his eyes was so substantial that it radiated out. Suddenly, the surrounding space was filled with killing intent. Chapter 23:10. Count the tall, old man's eyes flickered. He no longer looked down on the white-clothed young man. Instead, he was afraid of him. Of course, while he was fearful, he wasn't fearful to the point of being afraid of the might of this kid's sword strike. I admit that you're very strong. You must have been hiding your cultivation before. However, even so, it's impossible for you to kill me with one strike, the tall old man sneered. Oh, is that so? From the looks of it, you're very confident that you can withstand my sword. All right then, take a good look at this sword that's going to kill you. What exactly is it like? Zhuowen's eyes were still indifferent. He slowly raised the king's sword and placed it on his right shoulder. Then he stomped his right foot and disappeared like a ghost. When Zhuowen reappeared, he was already 10 meters in front of the old man. Zhuowen's sword had already slashed down. Rumble. The moment the sword slashed down, the surrounding space began to collapse and collapse. It was as if space had been completely obliterated at that moment. It was the last move of the Destruction Tao sword art. It was also the strongest move, Genesis Splitter. The power of Genesis Splitter was related to space. This time, Zhuowen had completely comprehended the law of space. The power of Genesis Splitter was much stronger than before. The tall old man's face finally changed completely. It was filled with fear, confusion, and regret. The strike was too powerful. The entire space was annihilated. He could not even move his limbs. Moreover, after the space was annihilated, waves of terrifying sword chi dispersed into the annihilated space. Then all of them blasted into his body and tore his body into pieces. The tall old man took one last look at the sword-wielding young man. The regret in his heart erupted like a volcano. Unfortunately, regret was useless. Zhuowen looked calmly at the tall old man who was annihilated by the sword chi. After comprehending the spatial law, Zhuowen knew that the power of the Destruction Tao sword art's final move, heaven splitting earth splitting, would increase a lot. In addition, his cultivation level had advanced to the Void Sky 7th level, so killing a late-stage Void Sky 8th level expert would not be a problem. Of course, Zhuowen would not be as relaxed as he was now if he had reached the peak of the Void Sky 8 ascensions. Not far away, the couple's faces were pale as they involuntarily retreated dozens of steps. Their eyes were filled with fear as they looked at the white-clothed youth who had taken away the old man's spirit ring. "Senior." When Zhuowen arrived in front of the couple, the two hurriedly bowed and greeted him. This person was able to easily kill the tall old man, which meant that this person's strength was above the two of them. Even though Zhuowen looked very young, in this world where strength reigned supreme, those who had reached the top would always be first. "Hand over the time crystal. I won't make things difficult for you," Zhuowen said calmly. The couple looked at each other and sighed softly. They had no choice but to take out all the time crystals they had just obtained and hand them over to Zhuowen. After taking the time crystals, the couple did not stay here for long. They cupped their fists at Zhuowen and left. Yao Xiangjuan and Wei Hua, who were originally fighting on the side, naturally saw that the battle had ended. Yao Xiangjuan's eyes were calm. He did not find it strange. After all, Zhuowen had already killed a late-stage Void Sky 8th level expert in front of him. It would be strange if that tall old man was Zhuowen's opponent. However, when he saw Zhuowen deal with the tall old man so easily, Yao Xiangjuan was still a little shocked. He remembered that Zhuowen had not killed the Temple Guardian so easily. Zhuowen's strength has increased a little compared to before, Yao Xiangjuan said in his heart. On the other hand, Wei Hua was greatly shocked and had the intention to retreat. Wei Hua roared angrily and suddenly punched out. Then this punch actually split into thousands of punches in an instant. The punches were like overlapping waves as they fiercely smashed in front of Yao Xiangjuan. Yao Xiangjuan's eyes narrowed. He coldly snorted and slashed out with his sword. Instantly, the sword light turned into an incomparably huge blue whale, blocking the countless punches in front of him. At the same time, the instant Yao Xiangjuan blocked the punches, he took out a handful of talismans from his spirit ring and threw them at Wei Hua without holding back. Every single one of these talismans was not ordinary. They all contained extremely terrifying energy. When a handful of talismans were thrown out, continuous explosions erupted from the talismans. Wei Hua was caught off guard and was enveloped by the explosions. When the explosions gradually subsided, Wei Hua's entire body became pitch black. He was in an exceptionally sorry state. He fell to the ground, spat out a mouthful of blood, and did not get up again. Zhuowen glanced at Wei Hua. He knew that Wei Hua's injuries were too serious. He was afraid that he would not live for long. Although Void Sky cultivators had the Void Sky Bridge, and their vitality was extremely tenacious, the talismans thrown out by Yao Xiangjuan were not ordinary. The power of the explosions went deep into the soul. Wei Hua's main injuries were not external, but the depths of his soul. With Zhuowen's powerful divine soul, he naturally could easily detect how serious Wei Hua's injuries were. This was also why he was certain that Wei Hua would die without a doubt. Thinking of this, Zhuowen glanced at Yao Xiangjuan again. This person was indeed not simple. Although Yao Xiangjuan's strength might be on par with Wei Hua during the battle, his trump cards were extremely powerful. Just now, when Yao Xiangjuan threw out so many talismans, even if it was Zhuowen, he would probably be in a sorry state. Of course, he would not die in such a sorry state like Wei Hua. Brother Zhua, I still underestimated you. I didn't expect you to be so powerful. Yao Xiangjuan put away Wei Hua's spirit ring and came in front of Zhuowen. His eyes were filled with fear and surprise. Zhuowen smiled slightly and said, "It was just luck." Yao Xiangjuan smiled embarrassedly. He naturally did not think that this was really Zhuowen's luck. However, since Zhuowen did not want to talk about this topic, Yao Xiangjuan would not pursue it. "Brother Yao, take this time crystal. I said that we would split it 40 to 60. Zhuowen casually threw a spirit ring to Yao Xiangjuan. The latter caught the spirit ring with slight surprise. He immediately checked it and said, Brother Joie, you really want to split it with me? These were all obtained by you. I am a man of my words. How could I take advantage of you in this matter? Zhuowen said indifferently. Yao Xiangjuan looked deeply at Zhuowen and smiled. He also took out the time crystal from Wei Hua's spirit ring and threw it to Zhuowen. He said, "This is 60% of the time crystal in Wei Hua's spirit ring. Brother Joie, please count it." Zhuowen took the time crystal and nodded. He directly put it into the spirit ring without any intention of counting it. Chapter 23:11. Snatch again, Brother Joie, what are your plans? Are you going to leave this place or stay here to comprehend the rules of time? Yao Xiangjuan looked at Joie and asked. I want to cross the divine river of time, Joie said in a deep voice. Yao Xiangjuan was shocked, then shook his head and said with a smile, Brother Joie, the divine river of time is too terrifying. Even if you have comprehended the rules of time, the flow of time in the divine river of time is still faster than the outside world. Moreover, we don't know how wide this divine river of time is, so Joie smiled and did not answer. Instead, he took out a praying mat and sat cross-legged on the shore. He began to comprehend the rules of time here. This was originally an area of time rules, and the power of time rules was emitted everywhere. Moreover, Joie could also feel that the flow of time around him was faster. Clearly, it was because of the rules of time. If the rules of time on the shore were so terrifying, then there was no need to mention the divine river of time. Joie did not know anything about the rules of time, so he naturally would not rashly enter the divine river of time. Yao Xiangjuan looked at Joie, who was sitting not far away, and smiled bitterly. He knew that Joie had already given him the answer. Yao Xiangjuan also found a secluded place, took out a praying mat, and sat down cross-legged. His gaze fell on the divine river of time in front of him, and he said in a daze, Brother Va, could it be that you want to cross the divine river of time for the space-time roulette? Joie's eyelids twitched, but he did not open his eyes. Instead, he fell into silence. Yao Xiangjuan did not mind, but continued to talk to himself. I once heard my master say that the most precious thing in the space-time river of quicksand is not the space crystal or the time crystal, but something called the space-time roulette. The speed of the space-time roulette is the fastest in the world. No one can compare to it. Even the top-flight divine tool in the heavenly domain cannot compare to the space-time roulette. Yao Xiangjuan said. Joie's heart stirred, and he was filled with curiosity about the space-time roulette. From Yao Xiangjuan's tone, Zhuowen could tell that the space-time roulette was a top-notch flying artifact. It could also be said that it was the fastest treasure in all of the heaven domains. However, Zhuowen was somewhat ignorant. He had not come to the river of space-time quicksand for the space-time roulette. Instead, he had come for the space-time key. As for whether the space-time roulette and the space-time key had any definite connection, Zhuowen was not very sure. If he could cross the divine river of time this time, Zhuowen would definitely look for the space-time key first. Then, if he had the chance, he might look for the so-called space-time roulette. Time ticked by. Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan sat on the shore, trying to comprehend the laws of time. 10 years passed in the blink of an eye. During this time, many cultivators came out of the spatial law zone and came to the shore of the divine river of time. As Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan's auras were not weak, most of the cultivators did not deliberately offend Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan. Of course, there were some who offended them, but they were basically dealt with by Xiaohe, who was guarding Zhuowen. For a time, the area around Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan became a forbidden area for other cultivators. Most of the cultivators who entered the temporal law zone were there to comprehend the laws of time. Therefore, many cultivators followed Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan's example and sat in this space, silently comprehending the laws of time, hoping to gain something. Among them, there were also some impatient cultivators who knew that there were good things like time crystals in the divine river of time. They could not suppress the greed in their hearts and entered the divine river of time. In the end, the moment these cultivators entered the divine river of time, their hair turned white, their skin became dry like tree bark, and their vitality was constantly washed away by the waves of the divine river of time. In the end, they died of old age in the divine river of time. Such an outcome was like a basin of cold water that was poured over most of the cultivators' heads. These cultivators no longer had any wishful thinking in their hearts. Instead, they obediently comprehended the laws of time first. The divine river of time would ebb and flow once every 10 years. It had been 10 years since the last ebb, and the second ebb was about to begin. At this moment, Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes. His eyes flickered with a bright light. In the past 10 years, he had been comprehending the laws of time all the time. He was not stingy in using up all the time crystals he had obtained. He also had a certain understanding and comprehension of the laws of time. Not enough. Zhuowen's eyes flickered. His gaze fell on the divine river of time in front of him again. He knew that the divine river of time was about to ebb again. Every time it ebbed, many time crystals would appear on the riverbed on the shore. If he wanted to quickly comprehend the laws of time, he could only rely on time crystals. Although Zhuowen had gained a lot in the past 10 years, he knew that his comprehension of the laws of time was still superficial. If he wanted to have a deeper understanding, he would need enough time crystals and sufficient time. Yao Xiangjuan also opened his eyes. He glanced at Zhuowen and saw the latter nodding and smiling slightly. He also knew what Zhuowen meant. Whoosh! The waves on the shore of the divine river of time suddenly surged. Then the water level on the shore was falling, revealing a part of the sparkling and translucent time crystals. As the water level continued to fall, more and more time crystals were exposed. Whoosh! 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 Before the water level had completely receded, many cultivators on the shore could not hold back and rushed out to snatch the exposed time crystals. Zhuowen and Yao Xiangjuan were no exception. Zhuowen's divine sense gushed out and turned into a big hand. In an instant, many time crystals were swept away. His speed was far faster than other cultivators. When the water level completely fell, the riverbed finally appeared in front of everyone. Everyone went crazy. Some cultivators even started to fight in order to snatch the time crystals. The scene became extremely chaotic. Zhuowen did not care about those cultivators who were fighting at all. Instead, he focused on grabbing the time crystals and collecting as many time crystals as he could. After a while, the time crystals on the exposed riverbed were basically all plundered. Apart from the bare riverbed, there were no more time crystals. As for Zhuowen, he had snatched more than half of the time crystals. Although Yao Xiangjuan could not compare to Zhuowen in terms of the number of time crystals he had snatched, it was still quite a number. At the very least, Yao Xiangjuan was quite satisfied. The rest of the time crystals were basically divided among other cultivators. However, the general situation was that there were too many monks and too little gruel. There was also a large number of cultivators who did not get a single time crystal at all. Chapter 2312. Space-time, Rilechuan, could not be bothered with those cultivators who were still arguing endlessly. He planned to find a secluded place and go into seclusion to comprehend the time rule again. He had a feeling that, with so many time crystals, he would definitely gain quite a bit in terms of time rule. However, just as Zhuowen left the riverbed and arrived at the shore, he was intercepted by a group of people. This group of people had a total of over 20 people, and the person in the lead was a man with an arrogant expression. The aura on this man's body was vast. He was actually also a void sky 7th-step powerhouse. "What's the matter?" Zhuowen said indifferently. "This brother, I saw that you acted extraordinarily just now and took away more than half of the time crystals. Brother, don't you think that you're too greedy? You alone took more than half of the time crystals." The arrogant man said indifferently. Zhuowen's gaze was indifferent as he glanced at the arrogant man and the 20 over people behind him, sneering coldly in his heart. Without needing to think, he also knew why these 20 over people were here. However, Zhuowen did not want to get entangled with these people and said coldly, "If you don't want to die, scram! These time crystals are ownerless to begin with. Whoever gets them will get them. It's my ability that I can get more than half of them. If you have the ability, go and snatch so many time crystals too." The arrogant man's face immediately darkened, and the 20 over people behind him also revealed looks of anger. "You're still in the right to take so many time crystals by yourself?" Everyone discovered the time crystals. "Since you took so many, you should take them out and share them equally with everyone." "That's right. What right do you have to take so many time crystals?" The 20 over people behind the arrogant man immediately clamored and blocked in front of Zhuowen, not having the slightest intention of letting him pass. The arrogant man's mouth revealed a mocking smile, and he said indifferently, "Brother, you see that everyone's voice is very loud. I think you should comply with the public opinion and take out the time crystals. Of course, you only need to take out 2/3 of the time crystals on you. Then you can keep the rest for yourself. How about it?" Zhuowen couldn't be bothered to talk nonsense with this arrogant man. He opened his hand and slammed it towards the arrogant man's face. The haughty man's eyes darkened. His divine power suddenly erupted, wanting to block Zhuowen's palm. But soon the arrogant man's expression changed. He found that he couldn't move. "Spatial rule power? You've completely comprehended the spatial laws. How can he be so strong?" The arrogant man's expression changed greatly. Unfortunately, just as he finished speaking, Zhuowen's palm ruthlessly slapped his face. "Puchi!" The arrogant man spat out a mouthful of blood mixed with broken teeth. Then he rolled a few times in the air before crashing to the ground in a sorry state. You crippled me!" The arrogant man raised his head with difficulty and glared at Zhuowen with resentment. Then he fell to the ground and completely lost consciousness. The remaining 20 or so people were stunned on the spot. Their bodies trembled as they looked at the white-clothed young man in front of them. Then they dispersed in an uproar. The arrogant man was the strongest among them, but he was knocked to the ground by the white-clothed young man with a single slap. They weren't fools. They knew that the white-clothed young man in front of them was far stronger than them. Zhuowen looked at this group of people silently. He didn't chase after them. Instead, he left this place. Although one needed to comprehend the spatial laws to enter the spatial laws area, generally speaking, one only needed to comprehend a part of the spatial laws to leave the spatial laws area. Therefore, most of the cultivators who entered the spatial laws area had only comprehended a part of the spatial laws. However, Zhuowen was different. He had completely comprehended the spatial laws. He was much stronger than the arrogant man and the others. In addition, the arrogant man was only 7 steps in the void sky. Zhuowen used the spatial laws to easily imprison the arrogant man on the spot, making him unable to move. The battle on Zhuowen's side naturally attracted the attention of many cultivators around, especially after seeing Zhuowen cripple the arrogant man with 7 steps in the void sky in one move. The cultivators who originally wanted to play tricks all gave up. This was a ruthless person. They didn't want to end up like that arrogant man. Yao Xiangjuan followed behind Zhuowen. He wasn't surprised that Zhuowen made a move. After spending some time together, Yao Xiangjuan had more or less figured out Zhuowen's character. Zhuowen was a very principled person. If others didn't offend him, he wouldn't offend them. If others offended him, he would definitely bite back. This kind of person couldn't be offended the most. Once offended, if this person couldn't be eliminated immediately, it would become an endless disaster in the future. In a valley far away from the divine river of time, Zhuowen found a cave in the surroundings. Seeing Yao Xiangjuan follow him in, Zhuowen was speechless. "Brother Yao, there are many caves in this valley. Why do you have to squeeze into a cave with me?" Yao Xiangjuan smiled faintly. His smile had a rare trace of charm. When Zhuowen saw this smile, he actually became absent-minded for a moment. Although Yao Xiangjuan was a man, he had a face that was more beautiful than a woman's. If Yao Xiangjuan wore women's clothes, no one would think that he was a man dressed as a woman. After regaining his senses, Zhuowen deliberately looked at the Adam's apple on Yao Xiangjuan's neck. After confirming that Yao Xiangjuan was indeed a man, he was relieved. Yao Xiangjuan also noticed Zhuowen's small movements. He frowned slightly but didn't say anything. Instead, he smiled and said, "Brother Zhuowen, don't worry. I won't disturb Brother Zhuo. Moreover, the two of us can take care of each other while cultivating." Zhuowen shrugged and didn't say anything. He took out a praying mat, sat down cross-legged, and continued to comprehend the time law. Yao Xiangjuan raised his eyebrows and didn't say anything. Instead, he sat cross-legged, not far away, silently cultivating and comprehending the time law. 5 years quietly passed. Zhuowen, who was sitting cross-legged on the praying mat, suddenly stood up. Then he threw out a punch. Instantly, the rock wall that his fist passed through became riddled with holes, as if it had been eroded by the wind. Zhuowen knew that this was the mark of the passage of time. Only after hundreds or thousands of years of weathering would a rock become riddled with holes. Yao Xiangjuan also sensed the commotion on this side. He looked at the stone wall that was riddled with holes next to Zhuowen and revealed a shocked expression. "Brother Zhuo, you have completely comprehended the laws of time." Zhuowen shook his head and said, "The temporal laws aren't that easy to comprehend. However, I've gained quite a bit of a grasp of the temporal laws. At the very least, I'm much more confident in traversing the river of time now." Yao Xiangjuan had a complicated look in his eyes. There was no doubt that Zhuowen's comprehension ability was stronger than his. Over the past 15 years, Yao Xiangjuan had been diligently comprehending the time law. Although he had made some progress in the time law, he couldn't compare with Zhuowen. At least, Yao Xiangjuan was far from reaching the point where he could cross the time river alone. Thinking of this, Yao Xiangjuan's eyes flickered. He gritted his teeth and said, "Brother Zhuo, can you help me cross the time river?" Zhuowen looked at Yao Xiangjuan in surprise. Just when he was about to refuse, Yao Xiangjuan said again, "If you can help me cross the time river, I can provide you with clues about the space-time roulette." Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and took a deep look at Yao Xiangjuan. It seemed that Yao Xiangjuan was hiding a lot of things from him. At least, he didn't think that Yao Xiangjuan was interested in the space-time roulette. Chapter 23:13. Entering the Divine River of Time. "Brother Yao, since you've told me all the clues about the space-time roulette, you might not be able to beat me when you enter the Divine River of Time," Zhuowen said with a smile. Yao Xiangjuan didn't seem to mind and said, "Brother Zhuo, you probably don't know that the space-time roulette is a flying treasure. As far as I know, there are no other flying divine weapons that can compare to the space-time roulette." But at this point, Yao Xiangjuan fell silent. However, Zhuowen had other thoughts in his mind. If the space-time roulette was really so magical, the true experts of the Six Desires Heavenly Palace should also enter the river of time and space to search for treasures. However, as far as Zhuowen was concerned, the strongest experts who had entered the river of time and space were the two white-robed elders. Their cultivations were only at the late stage of the Void Sky 8th step. He hadn't even seen an expert at the peak of the Void Sky 8th step. Obviously, this so-called space-time roulette might have some flaws, or it might just be a rumor. "Brother Yao, feel free to say what you want to say," Zhuowen said with a smile. "It's actually like this. When the space-time roulette first appeared in the space-time quicksand river, it caused several Void Sky 9th Ascension experts to fight over it. Even the Palace Master of Six Desires Palace took action. In the end, the space-time roulette was shattered by these experts." Yao Xiangjuan said with some embarrassment. Zhuowen's gaze suddenly became extremely strange. He didn't deny that the space-time roulette was a flying treasure, but a flying treasure that was shattered into pieces was equivalent to having no value at all. "Brother Zhuo, you may not know that the two core components of the space-time roulette are actually the space-time cores. Each space-time core contains extremely rich space-time power. If the space-time core is placed on a flying divine weapon, Its speed may not surpass that of the space-time roulette, but it's at least much faster than most flying divine weapons. Yao Xiangjuan took a deep breath and said with a slightly blazing gaze. Zhuo Wen took a deep look at Yao Xiangjuan. If what Yao Xiangjuan said was true, then the hollow space would be very useful. Although Zhuo Wen had several flying divine artifacts, they weren't very fast. They weren't even as fast as Zhuo Wen's speed if he went all out. Therefore, Zhuo Wen still wanted an extremely fast flying artifact from the bottom of his heart, and the space-time roulette obviously met the requirements in Zhuo Wen's heart. However, since the space-time roulette had already been shattered, he could only settle for the next best thing, which was to obtain the space-time hollow space. After a moment of silence, Zhuo Wen said, "Brother Yao, if what you said is true, I can bring you across the divine river of time. However, I cannot guarantee your safety." However, Yao Xiangjuan smiled and said, "It's fine. As long as Brother Zhuo can bring me across the divine river of time, it's fine. Let's go then." Zhuo Wen nodded and left the cave first. However, not long after Zhuo Wen left the cave, a black shadow suddenly rushed out from another cave in the valley and landed beside Zhuo Wen. This black shadow was a rather handsome young man. His face was very similar to Zhuo Wen's. He was dressed in a black robe and was Zhuo Wen's clone. Zhuo Wen had stayed in the time rule area for 15 years. During these 15 years, Zhuo Wen had basically released the black robe Zhuo Wen and let him absorb the calamity crystals and cultivate on his own. Although the black robe Zhuo Wen's speed of passing through the wind disasters was much slower than before, he had still passed through 5 wind disasters in the past 15 years. Including the first wind disaster, Zhuo Wen had passed through a total of 6 wind disasters. Just as Zhuo Wen had studied before, except for the first wind disaster that was more terrifying, the next 5 wind disasters were not as powerful as the first one. Therefore, the black-robed Zhuo Wen had passed through the wind disasters quite easily. Of course, Zhuo Wen also knew that when he passed through the 8th wind disaster and welcomed the 9th wind disaster, that would be the real challenge. The 9th wind disaster was the second hurdle, and its power was probably even more terrifying than the first wind disaster. For this reason, Zhuo Wen had made a lot of preparations in advance. If he was not very confident, he would not take the risk to try the 9th wind disaster. Yao Xiangjuan, who was following behind, stole a glance at the black-robed Zhuo Wen, and his eyes revealed a hint of fear. As early as when he was with Zhuo Wen, he knew that Zhuo Wen had a clone. What surprised him even more was that this clone of Zhuo Wen gave him a much stronger sense of crisis than the main body. Yao Xiangjuan knew what this meant. Obviously, Zhuo Wen's clone was stronger than the main body, and this clone was undoubtedly Zhuo Wen's final trump card. Thinking of this, Yao Xiangjuan became even more fearful of Zhuo Wen. He felt that this white-robed young man in front of him was really unfathomable. When he came to the shore of the divine river of time again, Zhuo Wen found that the number of people on the shore of the divine river of time had doubled. Cultivators could be seen sitting cross-legged on the shore, comprehending the laws of time. Of course, there were also a small number of cultivators who were arguing and fighting not far away. Divine power surged and boiled, and it was quite a spectacular sight. Zhuo Wen's arrival immediately attracted the attention of many cultivators on the shore. Many of them revealed a hint of fear in their eyes. Obviously, they recognized Zhuo Wen. Back then, the matter of Zhuo Wen crippling the arrogant man with a single slap had spread like wildfire after Zhuo Wen had left. Wherever Zhuo Wen passed, the surrounding cultivators would involuntarily make way for him. There were also some new cultivators who didn't know Zhuo Wen. When they saw the reverence in the other cultivators' eyes, their eyes revealed surprise and doubt. Of course, there would usually be people who would remind these newcomers of the identity of this seemingly harmless young man who was walking over. The new cultivators also revealed looks of fear. Zhuo Wen didn't care about the reverent gazes of the surrounding cultivators at all. He walked straight to the shore and stopped. What is this person trying to do? Could it be that he wants to enter the divine river of time? How is that possible? It's not like you don't know how terrifying the divine river of time is. This person wouldn't be so stupid as to go in and die. Discussions rang out one after another, all of them discussing Zhuowen's current actions. Zhuowen's next action completely shocked everyone around. Zhuowen took a step forward and jumped into the divine river of time. Yao Xiangjuan, who was following behind Zhuowen, didn't hesitate and jumped into the divine river of time with Zhuowen. The moment Zhuowen entered the divine river of time, Zhuowen could clearly feel that the flow of time was speeding up. Moreover, it was rapidly accelerating, and his vitality was rapidly depleting as time passed. Chapter 23:14. Crossing Zhuowen frowned slightly and raised his hands. The rule of time gushed out from his hands. Suddenly, the influence of the divine river of time on Zhuowen became much smaller, and Zhuowen's withered hands gradually returned to their original state. On the other hand, Yao Xiangjuan was desperately resisting the erosion of the rule of time the moment he entered the divine river of time. At this moment he was staggering, his face was pale, and the tips of his hair had turned white. It was obvious that his level up was passing very quickly. Zhuowen grabbed Yao Xiangjuan's right hand with one hand and immediately lifted Yao Xiangjuan up by the waist with the other hand. Yao Xiangjuan was almost entangled by the divine river of time and could not move at all. Zhuowen could only rely on this method to lift Yao Xiangjuan up. The moment Yao Xiangjuan was lifted up by Zhuowen, he could not help but exclaim. Then he began to struggle, as if he was not used to the feeling of being hugged by others. "Brother Yao, if you don't want to die, you'd better not move," Zhuowen said in a deep voice. Yao Xiangjuan's body stiffened. In the end, he did not struggle anymore. Instead, he lay meekly on Zhuowen's chest, but his cheeks were as red as an apple. Zhuowen's gaze was a little strange. It was the first time he had hugged a man, and a man as beautiful as a woman. Of course, this was also a helpless action. After all, the rule of time in the divine river of time was too strong, and Zhuowen had not completely comprehended the rule of time. If the two of them were not close, Zhuowen would not be able to protect Yao Xiangjuan. Yao Xiangjuan had obviously guessed Zhuowen's thoughts. Although his body was slightly unnatural, he did not say anything. However, what surprised Zhuowen was that Yao Xiangjuan's body was so soft that it was as if there were no bones. He was even softer than an ordinary woman. Zhuowen, who was hugging Yao Xiangjuan, did not feel that he was hugging a man at all. Instead, it felt more like a woman. "Brother Zhuo, let's go," Yao Xiangjuan gently reminded. Zhuowen recovered and nodded. He took a step forward with his right foot, and the space under his feet was immediately compressed. He took a step forward and instantly turned into a black dot in the distance. Countless cultivators on the banks of the divine river of time were stunned as they watched the two of them leave in an instant. These cultivators had personally experienced just how terrifying the divine river of time was. In the past, many cultivators had attempted to cross the divine river of time. However, they either died of old age upon entering the divine river of time or were drowned by the waves of time. Anyway, no one had walked more than 100 miles in the divine river of time. However, Zhuowen's speed was too terrifying. He disappeared in front of their eyes in an instant. It was more than 100 miles. It was more than 1,000 miles or even 10,000 miles. After taking 10 steps in a row, powerful spatial rules lingered around Zhuowen's body. Zhuowen could no longer see the shore of the divine river of time. All around him were gray waves of time. Zhuowen's eyes became extremely solemn. He had thoroughly comprehended the spatial rules. The distance he covered with 10 steps was at least 10 million miles. However, he didn't walk out of the divine river of time. Instead, he came to the endless waves of time. Zhuowen knew that the span of the divine river of time was even longer than he had imagined. Moreover, the spatial rules here seemed to be substantial. They densely covered the place and turned into various terrifying attacks. They swept over and bombarded Zhuowen's body. The attacks formed by the spatial rules were exceptionally terrifying. They were enough to kill any cultivator below the void sky ninth step. Even if it was Zhuo, if he had not grasped the time law to the point of great mastery, he would definitely die here. Of course, although Zhuo blocked the attacks of the spatial rules around him, he obviously didn't have it easy. The surface of Zhuo's skin and hair began to age. His eyes began to turn turbid, and his back became hunched. At this moment, Zhuo's youthful appearance turned into an old man of about 50 years old. This was the influence of the spatial rules. Zhuo knew that if he didn't walk out of the divine river of time as soon as possible, he would continue to age until he died. Yao Xiangjuan curled up in Zhuo's arms. He obviously noticed Zhuo's strange state. His gaze changed drastically, and he said, "Brother Zhuo, are you okay?" "Don't talk. I'm fine," Zhuo said in a low voice. He took another step forward. The spatial rules and temporal rules were used to the extreme. Yao Xiangjuan naturally didn't dare to say anything. However, he was rather worried about Zhuo. Seeing that Zhuo was beginning to age, he felt rather guilty. If Zhuo didn't want to bring him along, he knew that with Zhuo's strength, he should be able to cross the divine river of time very quickly. Zhuo took another 10 steps. His hair was completely white, and his appearance was that of a 70-year-old old man. However, he still couldn't cross the divine river of time. He was still surrounded by gray waves of time. "Brother Zhuo, put me down. I should be the one dragging you down this time. I didn't expect the divine river of time to be so terrifying. I miscalculated." Yao Xiangjuan sighed softly. Zhuo didn't care. Instead, he kept moving forward like a demon. Although his body was constantly aging, his eyes became brighter and brighter, like the most resplendent stars in the night sky. Being in the divine river of time and experiencing the terror of the temporal rules in the divine river of time, Zhuo had a deeper understanding of the temporal rules. Outside the divine river of time, Zhuo had a deep understanding of the temporal rules with the help of time crystals and had reached the level of great success. However, no matter how rich the temporal rules in the outside world were, they couldn't be compared to the temporal rules in the divine river of time. More than 90% of the temporal rules in the temporal rule area were gathered in the divine river of time. The divine river of time was the best place to comprehend the temporal rules. However, the temporal rules in the divine river of time were too powerful. Therefore, ordinary cultivators didn't dare to comprehend the temporal rules in the divine river of time. It was too late for them to escape. Zhuo already had a certain level of understanding of the time law. Now that he was deep in the divine river of time, he had personally experienced the terrifying power of the time law in the divine river of time. Hence, he naturally understood some of the minor details of the time law. "I understand. The temporal rules in the divine river of time have been restraining me, making me go in circles," Zhuo murmured in a low voice. He glanced at the gray waves of time around him. The waves of time here were almost exactly the same as the waves of time when he first came here. In other words, the divine river of time had reversed the flow of time. No matter how many steps Zhuo took forward, even if he exerted the spatial rules to the extreme, it would be useless. He would be reversed by the divine river of time to the place where he first came to Zhuo. If Zhuo wanted to step out of the divine river of time, the first thing he had to do was break the reversal of time. When Yao Xiangjuan saw Zhuo's enlightened expression, he immediately remained silent for fear of disturbing Zhuo. Boom! Zhuo took a deep breath and then suddenly punched out. His fist was wrapped in gray energy. The gray energy looked extremely strange. This punch actually had a charm that could take one's soul away. And this charm seemed to be able to last forever, forever staying still in time. Bang! The fist contained a powerful rule of time. With one punch, the surrounding waves of time were all shattered. Like broken glass, they shattered into pieces. Chapter 23:15. Necklace. Boom! 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 Zhuowen moved forward while throwing out punches with his right fist. His left hand hugged Yao Xiangjuan as he moved forward. Waves of time surged toward Zhuowen like angry dragons. They seemed to want to envelop Zhuowen and turn him into dust. Unfortunately, Zhuowen had finally comprehended the rules of time after being lost. With a punch, the waves of time were basically broken by Zhuowen. Zhuowen punched with every step he took. After taking 5 steps, he finally stepped onto the ground. Putting down Yao Xiangjuan, Zhuowen turned around and looked at the endless river of time behind him. He sighed softly in his heart. His entire body went limp on the ground, powerless. Fortunately, Yao Xiangjuan was quick to react. He grabbed Zhuowen's arms with both hands and tried to straighten him up. Unfortunately, Yao Xiangjuan was also deeply affected by the river of time. His actual situation was not much different from Zhuowen's. The moment Yao Xiangjuan grabbed Zhuowen, he knew something was wrong. Then, Zhuowen fell toward him. Yao Xiangjuan was powerless. He could only watch as Zhuowen fell and pressed him to the ground. Go! At this moment, Yao Xiangjuan's cheeks were as red as a ripe apple. He was powerless and had no strength to move Zhuowen away. However, when he saw Zhuowen's white hair and fainted, Yao Xiangjuan gradually calmed down. He reached out and gently stroked Zhuowen's white hair. His gaze was complicated and moved. Yao Xiangjuan knew very well that if Zhuowen were to cross the river of time alone, he would not be in such a sorry state. But this time he brought him along, which made it more difficult for Zhuowen to cross the river of time. What Yao Xiangjuan couldn't forget was that in the desperate situation of the divine river of time, he had originally planned to ask Zhuowen to abandon him and cross the divine river of time alone. However, Zhuowen had asked him to shut up and continue advancing on the divine river of time. At that moment, Zhuowen's figure could no longer be erased from Yao Xiangjuan's mind. After resting for a while, the feeling of weakness in Yao Xiangjuan's body lessened a lot. He immediately moved, but just as he started to move, with a red face, Yao Xiangjuan gently released Zhuowen's hands and laid Zhuowen's body on the ground. Only then did he slowly stand up. At this moment, Yao Xiangjuan's long hair was completely scattered. Her beautiful face and messy long hair gave her a delicate appearance. Fortunately, this Zhuowen has fainted. Otherwise, we might have been exposed. Moreover, after taking off the crystal necklace, Yao Xiangjuan's face became even more beautiful and enchanting. This was a kind of suffocating beauty. If others were to see such a face, they might really suffocate. It was simply too beautiful. Yao Xiangjuan gently pulled up her hair, then took out a small comb and gently combed her beautiful hair. After washing up, Yao Xiangjuan's beautiful eyes fell on Zhuowen. Brother Zhuo, thank you for helping me cross the river of time. Actually, I lied to you. Although there are 2 space-time heart, the clue I provided was actually only 1 space-time heart. Yao Xiangjuan sighed softly. Then, she took off the crystal necklace from her neck and put it on Zhuowen's neck. This crystal necklace had an extremely obscure concealment ability. Relying on this crystal necklace, Yao Xiangjuan had never let outsiders see that he was actually a woman. Even the strongest of the Void Sky 9 steps might not be able to tell that Yao Xiangjuan's true identity was actually a woman. And the reason why Yao Xiangjuan's cultivation was so obscure naturally had a lot to do with this crystal necklace. Of course, Yao Xiangjuan knew that in addition to having an extremely powerful concealment ability, her necklace also had an even more important function. This was because this crystal necklace contained an extremely powerful life source. And this powerful life source was enough to allow Yao Xiangjuan to escape a fatal crisis. It could be said that it was Yao Xiangjuan's most important life-saving item. The space-time heart is very important to me. Brother Zhuo, don't blame me for deceiving you. I am a person who doesn't like to owe others favors, but this time I owe you a huge favor. At present, I have no way to repay this favor. Take this life heart as a reward for your favor." At this point, Yao Xiangjuan gently put the crystal necklace on Zhuowen's neck. Then, the green light in the crystal poured into Zhuowen's chest. This green light contained an extremely rich life force. As this green light poured into Zhuowen's body, the latter's withered skin began to moisten, and his white hair began to turn black. Zhuowen's originally weak aura was like a dry land that had been moistened by rain and dew, gradually becoming stronger. Yao Xiangjuan looked at Zhuowen, whose aura was gradually growing stronger, and let out a light breath. Then she looked at Zhuowen's side, stomped her right foot, and completely disappeared from where she was, rushing forward. Zhuowen's eyelids slowly trembled, and then he opened them. Zhuowen sat up, looked around blankly, and muttered in a low voice, "I fainted." But soon, Zhuowen noticed that there was an extremely strong life force in his chest, which was pouring into his body, causing a comfortable feeling to rise up from his body. "What is this?" Zhuowen held up the crystal necklace in front of his chest with his right hand, looked at the crystal necklace in his palm with bright eyes, and said in surprise, "What a powerful life force! What exactly is this necklace?" Zhuowen's eyes revealed a look of surprise. The life force that emerged from this crystal necklace was simply something he had never seen before in his life. Needless to say, Zhuowen knew that this crystal necklace was absolutely priceless. Chapter 23:16. Beauty is poisonous. Did Brother Yao give this to me? Zhuowen thought of something and wanted to look for Yao Xiangjuan, but he found that there was no one around. Zhuowen frowned. He was sure that Yao Xiangjuan had given him the crystal necklace. But where did Yao Xiangjuan go after leaving the necklace behind? Yao Xiangjuan still had the clue to the space-time hollow. Now that Yao Xiangjuan had disappeared, it meant that the clue to the space-time hollow was gone. Zhuowen was worried that something might have happened to Yao Xiangjuan. However, the area was gray, and it was difficult to identify the direction. Looking for a person here was like looking for a needle in a haystack. "Sai, I should go look for the space-time key first. Maybe I can meet Brother Yao on the way." Zhuowen sighed and took out the yellow map from his spirit ring. The destination of the map was the location of the space-time key, and Zhuowen found that the location on the map was not far from here. Whoosh! After confirming the location, Zhuowen moved and left the place in an instant. Along the way, Zhuowen's eyes became more and more serious. He was sure that this place should be the third region of the river of space-time quicksand, the space-time law region, because he felt the space-time law and the space-time law at the same time in this space. The two great laws were independent, yet interdependent. This subtle relationship caused Zhuowen, who was hurrying along, to suffer a lot. In this space where the space-time law and the space-time law coexisted, there was the infinite space in the space-time law region, and there was also the rapid flow of time in the space-time law region. This greatly slowed down Zhuowen's progress. However, Zhuowen had comprehended the space-time law and the space-time law. Although this space where the space-time law and the space-time law coexisted was difficult to deal with, Zhuowen could barely deal with it and continued to move forward. Zhuowen moved forward for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, he was also comprehending the coexistence of the space-time law and the space-time law in this place. However, the more he researched, the more he realized that it would be very difficult for the time and space laws to coexist. At the very least, he was unable to grasp the laws behind them. Of course, the more Zhuowen researched, the more he admired the expert who had created the space-time temple and the space-time key. He knew that mastering the space-time law was probably not as simple as comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao law. To a certain extent, the path to mastering the space-time law was much more difficult than comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao law. This was because space-time contained the laws of time and space. Moreover, after you fully comprehended these two laws, you had to try to find the pattern between these two laws. Only by grasping this pattern could you touch the threshold of the space-time law. However, this was only the threshold of the space-time law. There was still a long way to go before he could fully grasp the space-time law. Although the laws of heavenly Tao were fraught with difficulties, reaching the 9 steps, void sky steps, only required one to grasp a wisp of the laws of heavenly Tao. In terms of difficulty, it was indeed slightly easier than completely grasping the laws of space-time. Moreover, the steps were not as complicated as the laws of space-time. It was no wonder that many cultivators who reached the 9 steps, void sky ascension relied on comprehending a trace of the heavenly Tao. After all, this method was the most convenient and simple. Of course, there were many benefits to mastering the space-time law to reach the 9 steps void sky. The complete space-time law was much stronger than a trace of the heavenly Tao law. Even if the heavenly Tao law was superior to the space-time law, it was only a trace of the heavenly Tao law. Naturally, it could not be compared to the complete space-time law. Of course, many cultivators did not know about this, and Zhuowen had only heard about it from Ma Yujie. At first, he didn't believe the damn fatty, but now that he had comprehended the time and space laws, he began to believe the damn fatty's words. Su Tian Nindeng, who had grasped the space-time law, was much stronger than Su Tian Nindeng, who had grasped a trace of the heavenly Tao. 3 days later, Zhuowen stopped in his tracks. His gaze landed in front of him. A magnificent world appeared in front of Zhuowen. It was different from the gloomy and dim aura of the other places. Standing there, Zhuowen felt like he was standing on a beach where the sun was about to set below the sea level. The red sunset glow was like a rainbow that formed a rainbow bridge over the distant sea. It also looked like a flame that was devouring the sea level. It looked magnificent and majestic. At the farthest point of the sunset clouds, a cliff slowly rose above the sea level as if it was sending off the last touch of the sunset. This is Zhuowen frowned slightly. He looked at the magnificent sunset scenery in front of him and felt a sense of awe. The sun sets in the west. The heartbroken person is at the end of the world. Suddenly, this poem involuntarily appeared in Zhuowen's mind. A feeling of sadness and twilight gradually rose in his heart. This was a lament about the passage of time and the absence of return. It was also a sigh about how time had flown by. Everything in the world, no matter how poor they were, was equal and the same when the sun set. The past, the present, the future, everything would eventually pass away. Just like the beautiful sunset, everything would eventually fall. Zhuowen stood silently under this beautiful sunset. He quietly looked at the sunset hanging above the sea level for 3 days and 3 nights. For 3 days and 3 nights, the sunset quietly hung high above the sea level. It did not set, nor did it show any signs of setting. It was as if time had stopped at the last moment of the sunset. Zhuowen's eyes showed that he was pondering. Then he took out the map from the spirit ring again and carefully observed the location of the space-time key on the map. After confirming it again and again, Zhuowen found that the location of the space-time key was on the sea level under the beautiful sunset. Putting away the map, Zhuowen looked at the sunset in the distance again and sighed. This sunset in the west is beautiful, but behind the beauty is infinite danger. Beauty is actually poisonous. But the helpless thing is that even if it is poisonous, I have to go in and try. How ironic. Having said that, Zhuowen took a step forward and jumped into the strange sea. What surprised Zhuowen was that the instant his feet landed on the surface of the sea, he discovered that the surface of the sea was actually still. Although it looked like a gentle sea, it had actually been completely frozen at this moment by time, and Zhuowen stepped into this place as if he was walking on flat ground. Not only that, the moment Zhuowen entered the sea surface, he found that his consciousness was actually infinitely suppressed. Originally, his consciousness could extend hundreds of millions of miles without a problem, but after entering the sea surface, his consciousness could only extend to a range of 10 miles. Moreover, Zhuowen felt that not only was his consciousness suppressed, but he was also surrounded by an endless vicissitude of time. Zhuowen was all too familiar with this feeling. It was the same feeling as the time law area. It was the feeling of time passing. Moreover, the passage of time in this sunset area was much faster than in the time law area. With the passage of time, Zhuowen also found that the surrounding space was constantly changing. Zhuowen looked at the sunset in front of him and found that it was sometimes far and sometimes near. Chapter 23:17. The setting sun. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen began to move forward. The place where the setting sun stopped was the location of the space-time key that Zhuowen knew to be. However, Zhuowen knew very well that it would be extremely difficult to approach the end of the setting sun. Day after day passed. Zhuowen walked on the surface of the sea for over a month, but the end of the setting sun was still so far away. Moreover, Zhuowen discovered that time passed even faster than before. If it weren't for the Heart of Life necklace on his chest providing him with an endless supply of vitality, Zhuowen knew that he might have already shown signs of aging. Finally, Zhuowen stopped. His eyes flickered as he said softly, "I can't keep going like this. There's a powerful law of space-time here. Time and space are fused together. Time is flying and space is also switching." Zhuowen knew that it would be pointless for him to keep going like this. He would probably lose himself under the beautiful setting sun. "I have to find the pattern between the laws of time and space. Otherwise, I won't be able to take a single step here." Zhuowen calmed down as he spoke. Then he took out a praying mat and sat down cross-legged on it. He began to study the pattern and flow of laws in the sea of setting sun. Zhuowen had completely comprehended the laws of time and space, but he was still rather ignorant about the laws of space-time. However, Zhuowen firmly believed that as long as he could understand the laws of time and space, he would be able to truly enter the threshold of the laws of space-time. At that time, Zhuowen would not be unable to take a single step in the sea of setting sun. Time ticked by. Zhuowen sat upright on the meditation cushion and concentrated on pondering the laws of space and time in the surroundings, and his gaze revealed an expression of deep thought. Zhuowen sat like this for 3 whole years. During these 3 years, he studied the laws of space-time without moving at all. It was as if he was possessed. Finally, Zhuowen slowly opened his eyes. His eyes shone with a dazzling light. In the past 3 years, although Zhuowen still didn't understand the space-time rules, he had some understanding of the laws of time and space operating at the same time. Although he only understood a little, it was a big step for Zhuowen. At least now that he understood this pattern, Zhuowen knew that he wouldn't get lost in the sea of sunset anymore. Zhuowen stood up and put away the praying mat, but his eyes fell on the necklace with the Heart of Life on it. The surface of the necklace was still emitting a green light, but compared to the beginning, the green light was much dimmer. Clearly, in the past 3 years, the surging vitality of the necklace had been greatly depleted. From this, it could be seen how terrifying the setting sun was. In just 3 years, it had already depleted the vitality of the Heart of Life to such an extent. Of course, it was also thanks to this Heart of Life that Zhuowen could quietly go into seclusion to comprehend the laws of time and space. Otherwise, with the influence of the terrifying power of the setting sun, it would have been difficult for Zhuowen to comprehend the laws of time and space with peace of mind. However, the Heart of Life gave him a good environment. This was also why Zhuowen could touch the threshold of the space-time rules in 3 years. Of course, there was still a big gap from the real space-time rules, and Zhuowen knew this. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen temporarily took off the Heart of Life and put it in the spirit ring. He had already determined that this Heart of Life belonged to Yao Xiangjuan. Now that he had consumed it for 3 years, the vitality inside was actually not much. If he continued to wear it, he was afraid that the vitality of the Heart of Life would be completely exhausted. Zhuowen still planned to return this Heart of Life to Yao Xiangjuan after he found him. Naturally, he couldn't squander all the vitality in the Heart of Life. Otherwise, when he saw Yao Xiangjuan, he wouldn't be able to explain himself. After putting away the Heart of Life, Zhuowen clearly felt the terrifying feeling of time passing. When he stepped out, the surrounding space produced a strange and powerful pressure. Moreover, the cooperation of time and space in this place was extremely tacit. Zhuowen actually felt that his hands and feet were tied. It seems that this necklace really has a big effect. Zhuowen smiled bitterly. He didn't expect that after taking off the necklace, he would feel so uncomfortable. At least, he was not used to this kind of feeling of being tied up. Now he was even more certain that this necklace given to him by Yao Xiangjuan was definitely an extraordinary divine object. However, he was surprised that Yao Xiangjuan would leave this thing to him and leave without saying goodbye. Could it be that there was some secret behind it? However, Zhuowen vaguely guessed that Yao Xiangjuan might have something to do with the heart of time and space. Of course, no matter what Yao Xiangjuan thought, Zhuowen was still very grateful to Yao Xiangjuan for giving him this necklace. Otherwise, Zhuowen wouldn't have recovered so quickly and wouldn't have been so relaxed after entering the Sea of Sunset. Now that Zhuowen had touched the threshold of the space-time law, even without the necklace, he wouldn't feel too strange. More importantly, at least he wouldn't get lost in this beautiful sunset as easily as before. For the next period of time, Zhuowen basically walked in the Sea of Sunset. And because Zhuowen had touched the threshold of the space-time law, he was no longer lost in this sea like before. The sunset at the end of the sea was also not as far away as before, no matter how far Zhuowen went. At least Zhuowen could now feel that he was slowly approaching the sunset at the end of the sea. Of course, the closer he got to the sunset, Zhuowen realized that the flow of time was faster and the restrictions of space were stronger. The suppression of space-time was also stronger. Gradually, Zhuowen's skin started to age, and his hair gradually turned white. He was gradually aging under the suppression of space-time. When Zhuowen finally arrived in front of the cliff under the setting sun, he had completely become a white-haired old man, and his vitality was constantly being taken away. Although Zhuowen now looked like an old man in his twilight years, his eyes became brighter and clearer. Standing in front of the cliff, Zhuowen looked at the cliff in front of him and fell into deep thought. The cliff in front of him stood on the sea under the setting sun. Zhuowen noticed that this cliff was extremely high. If he looked carefully, he could see that the base of the cliff should be at the bottom of the Sea of Sunset. Chapter 23:18. Time is eternal. Zhuowen stared at the cliff in front of him with bright eyes. Once again, he thought of the poem that he had sighed with emotion. The sun sets in the west, and the heartbroken man is at the end of the world. This seemingly endless cliff that went straight into the clouds was probably the so-called end of the world, and the space-time key that Zhuowen was looking for should be here. Thinking of this, Zhuowen pushed off with his right foot and plunged into the sea around the cliff. The seawater in other places had already been frozen by time. Only the seawater in this area was still flowing, and Zhuowen was able to enter the base of the cliff through the flowing seawater. Although Zhuowen didn't know what was at the base of the cliff, he had a feeling that the space-time key should be there. Of course, all of this was just his intuition. Zhuowen had to go down and see for himself whether it was true or not. The moment Zhuowen plunged into the sea, he felt a bone-chilling coldness on his face. This coldness made Zhuowen's whole body shiver, and his body aged even faster. Clearly, the speed at which time passed in the sea was even more terrifying than on the surface. Zhuowen had no choice but to take out the necklace that Yao Xiangjuan had given him. He knew that with the speed at which time passed, Zhuowen would probably die of old age before he could reach the bottom of the sea. Therefore, he had no choice but to borrow the power of the necklace. After putting on the necklace, the aging speed of Zhuowen's body slowed down a lot. Moreover, relying on the surging vitality of the necklace, Zhuowen even started to become younger. Zhuowen looked at the necklace with a pained expression. The green light wasn't very bright, and he knew that although the vitality of the necklace wasn't much, it should be enough for him to last for quite some time. However, he was helpless because the vitality was decreasing every time he used it. This time he was afraid that he would have to use up a lot of the vitality of the necklace. If he used up the necklace, Zhuowen would be too embarrassed to meet Yao Xiangjuan again. Soon, Zhuowen dived to the bottom of the sea. Then he saw a shocking scene at the bottom of the sea. The bottom of the sea was simply a world of ice. Except for the several feet around the cliff, which was seawater, the surrounding was a world of frozen ice and snow. Zhuowen knew that the world of ice and snow around him was not really the power of ice and snow, but the power of time stagnation. When the seawater was still at a certain point in time, it would solidify as if it was frozen by cold air, forming an extremely low temperature ice-like object. The surrounding seawater also followed the same principle. In addition, Zhuowen also saw many creatures in this world of ice and snow. Most of them were marine creatures. However, he also saw many cultivators. These cultivators were frozen in the sea, motionless. Zhuowen's gaze turned solemn. He discovered that most of the frozen cultivators' auras weren't weak. There were even a few cultivators whose auras weren't any weaker than Kuang Li from the quicksand family. Clearly, this cultivator was most likely a half-step void sky 9th ascension expert. Furthermore, these cultivators were arranged in a very orderly manner. They actually surrounded the bottom of the cliff in a circular formation. Zhuowen guessed that the range of seawater around the cliff wasn't just a few feet. It was very likely that it was hundreds of feet or even thousands of feet. However, for some unknown reason, the nearby seawater was frozen in time, and the cultivators who were still in the sea were unfortunately frozen in time with the seawater. Zhuowen looked around, and his gaze became more and more solemn. He felt that the bottom of the cliff wasn't simple. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to freeze so many cultivators. Zhuowen's attention quickly fell on a remote corner on the left. In the ice and snow closest to the seawater, a beautiful figure completely attracted Zhuowen's attention. This was an extremely beautiful woman. The reason why she attracted Zhuowen's attention wasn't because of her beautiful appearance, but because she was no stranger to Zhuowen. Yao Xiangjuan? Zhuowen frowned slightly. This beautiful woman was the beautiful woman that Zhuowen had met in the space law area before. At that time, this beautiful woman claimed to be Yao Xiangjuan's sister. Previously, Zhuowen had gone to a secret realm with Yao Xiangjuan and found a large number of spatial crystals inside. At that time, Zhuowen had a pretty good impression of Yao Xiangjuan. However, Zhuowen felt that something was strange. Why was Yao Xiangjuan at the bottom of the cliff? If he remembered correctly, Yao Xiangjuan shouldn't be able to cross the Time Divine River. It was already very good that she could enter the Time Law area. However, Yao Xiangjuan had entered the bottom of the cliff before him and was frozen in time in the seawater. This made Zhuowen even more puzzled. Sizing up Yao Xiangjuan, who was trapped in time, Zhuowen's gaze quickly fell on Yao Xiangjuan's right hand. He saw that Yao Xiangjuan was holding a transparent crystal the size of half a palm. Upon closer inspection, the shape of this transparent crystal was somewhat similar to a heart. Space-time hollow. Zhuowen looked at the transparent crystal in Yao Xiangjuan's palm and recalled the space-time hollow that Yao Xiangjuan had mentioned to him before. He quickly associated the two. Yao Xiangjuan's time should have frozen not long ago. What happened here at that time? Zhuowen thought to himself. However, he became more and more vigilant. He saw unwillingness and fear in Yao Xiangjuan's open eyes. What happened at that time that made Yao Xiangjuan reveal such an expression? Just as Zhuowen was lost in thought, an extremely horrifying feeling rose from Zhuowen's feet and rushed along his spine to the back of Zhuowen's head. This feeling was too strong. It was definitely a feeling that Zhuowen had never felt before. It was as if his lifeline had been strangled by an invisible force at this moment. What is your purpose in entering the bottom of the space-time cliff? A deep voice slowly sounded in Zhuowen's ears, but Zhuowen could not tell where the voice came from. You only have 3 breaths of time. If you don't give me an answer, you will end up like those cultivators. The deep voice sounded again, but there was a trace of impatience in the voice. Zhuowen took a deep breath and said helplessly, "I'm here for the space-time key." The deep voice was silent for a moment, but then it laughed loudly. "You are very honest." "Pucci!" Zhuowen spat out a mouthful of blood. His chest felt as if it had been hit hard, and he was suddenly sent flying and smashed into the edge of the cliff behind him. Because the force was too great, Zhuowen's whole body was embedded in the cliff wall. Zhuowen's eyes revealed a look of horror. His face was as pale as snow, and the will to resist in his heart had completely disappeared. This unknown power was too terrifying. In front of this power, Zhuowen actually felt powerless. It was as if he was an ant facing a vast ocean. Back then, when Zhuowen faced great Brahma and Mu Qinxue, whose temperament had changed drastically, he did not feel this way. But now, facing this unknown force, he actually felt this strange feeling. Chapter 2319. Mysterious Head, Who Are You? Zhuowen's entire body was embedded in the rock wall. He wanted to break free from the rock wall, but he found that there were many stone hands stretching out from the rock wall, grabbing Zhuowen's limbs and neck, firmly fixing him in the rock wall. These stone hands were not ordinary stone hands, but stone hands that contained extremely powerful space-time laws. The moment Zhuowen's limbs were grabbed by these stone hands, he felt that time and space were completely sealed, and he could not move at all. Zhuowen raised his head, his pupils constricting into needles as he stared straight ahead. It was unknown when, but a huge head had appeared in front of them. This head was as big as Zhuowen's entire body. However, its face was glistening with blood, and it looked exceptionally ferocious and terrifying. It was almost to the point of being badly mutilated. Moreover, Zhuowen also found that this huge head had only one eye, and the left eye was incomplete, leaving only an empty bloody hole, from which thick black blood was constantly flowing. The right eye was quite strange. The white of the eye was blood red, and the pupil was golden. When the pupil blinked, an extremely strange blood flame would spurt out. The moment he saw the right eye of this head, Zhuowen's pupils unconsciously shrank, because this was not the first time he had seen this right eye, but the second time. Back then, when he was in the Sun-Moon Lake, he had entered a strange, small world. There was a blood-stained cliff, and an eyeball was suppressed in that cliff. That eyeball was exactly the same as the right eye of the head in front of him. There was no doubt that this eyeball should be the empty left eye of this head. It must be known that Ma Yujia had guessed that the eyeball suppressed in the blood-stained cliff should be the eyeball of a Tao-confirming powerhouse. Tao-confirming powerhouses were even more terrifying than Su Tian Juding. Zhuowen was very clear that this bloody head in front of him was a Tao-confirming powerhouse. Although this bloody head did not seem to have any harmful power, Zhuowen knew that as long as this head wanted to, it could kill him. "You've seen me?" The mangled head took a deep look at Zhuowen before it slowly opened its mouth and said. Zhuowen frowned but didn't say anything. The head in front of him was too terrifying. It could kill him as easily as squashing an ant. Zhuowen didn't dare to say anything. "Do you want me to search your soul? Are you still not going to speak?" The head said coldly. Zhuowen sneered again and again, but he still didn't say anything. If this head could search one's soul, it probably wouldn't waste any words with him and would directly search his soul. However, the head hadn't done so. Instead, it had asked Zhuowen to say it himself. This meant that the head didn't have the ability to search his soul. "I said yes, but I also want to ask you a question," Zhuowen said in a deep voice. The head narrowed its eyes. It was a little surprised that the little cultivator in front of it was not only not frightened by it, but also fearlessly raised conditions with it. "Interesting. Answer my question first." After the head finished speaking, it noticed Zhuowen remained indifferent, and it said with slight displeasure, "Don't worry, I always keep my word. It's impossible for me to go back on my word." The head obviously paused for a moment when it spoke of its name, and Zhuowen suspected that the head's memories were missing or had been sealed by someone. Otherwise, it was impossible for it to even forget its name. All right, Zhuowen agreed, and then he pondered for a moment before he said, I once saw an eyeball on a bloodied cliff, and this eyeball was exactly the same as your eyeball. There was a pool of true dragon blood at the side of that bloodied cliff, and an enormous heart was sealed within that pool of blood. When he spoke up to hear, Zhuowen recalled the words he'd heard on the bloodied cliff that day, and he couldn't help but mutter, Return my heart, return my eyes, return my arms, return my legs, return everything to me. Boom! After Zhuo Wengang finished speaking, a terrifying thunderous voice suddenly resounded. Then a terrifying gust of wind came crashing down like a 10,000 zhang tall mountain. Zhuowen, who was embedded in the rock wall, was the closest to the head. Immediately his chest was blasted open by this terrifying gust of wind. Blood gushed out, and he was seriously injured. If it weren't for the necklace on Zhuowen's chest, which had a strong vitality, Zhuowen wouldn't have been able to keep his life. In addition, Zhuowen's whole body was bound, and he couldn't take out the heavenly domain star essence. So the necklace on his body could really be said to have saved Zhuowen's life. When Zhuowen's blasted chest gradually recovered in the green light, the necklace on Zhuowen's chest finally became completely dim and lost its last trace of vitality. Zhuowen sighed softly. He knew that the necklace was now completely useless, but at the same time he was shocked by the terror of this head. Just the aura it revealed almost killed him. If it weren't for this necklace, Zhuowen would have been doomed. Perhaps noticing Zhuowen's strange state, the head restrained its powerful aura and looked at Zhuowen excitedly. It said in a deep voice, Do you know where my eyes are? Zhuowen took a deep breath. He didn't dare to talk in riddles. This head was too terrifying, and he really didn't dare to neglect it. If this guy was angry, its aura would be even more terrifying. It's suppressed in a blood-stained cliff, but it's very far from here. It's not in the Six Desires heavenly domain, but in another heavenly domain, Zhuowen said in a deep voice. I didn't expect you to have clues about my eyes. Little brat, as long as you can help me get my eyes and heart back, I will give you a great fortune, the head said with a burning gaze. Zhuowen sneered in his heart and said indifferently, Senior, why don't you take a look at my current situation? I'm trapped here by you. How can I help you get your eyes and heart back? And if I'm not wrong, you should be a Tao-proving expert. Even if it's your eyes, I can't bring them back. I'm too weak. The head was stunned. Immediately it saw Zhuowen's situation and calmed down completely. What you said is not unreasonable. After the head finished speaking, Zhuowen felt his limbs loosen. Immediately, the stone hands that grabbed his limbs slowly retracted into the rock wall and disappeared completely. You came here for the space-time key? The head asked indifferently. Zhuowen nodded, but his gaze was on guard as he looked at the mangled head. I'm afraid you don't know the price of coming here. Look at those guys. Most of them came for the space-time key. Of course, a small part of them came for the space-time core. Chapter 23:20. Trials. Zhuowen's gaze landed on Yao Xiangjuan, who had been completely frozen in time. Even though this beautiful woman had been completely frozen in time, she still gave off a soul-stirring beauty. Coupled with the helplessness and fear in Yao Xiangjuan's eyes, it was very easy to arouse a man's desire to protect her. Senior, are they all dead? Zhuowen asked in a heavy voice. The head shook its head and said indifferently, They've been frozen in time. In that time, they've become eternal, but they haven't died. Of course, their current state is no different from being dead. Zhuowen sighed gently when he heard that. He could tell from the mysterious head that Yao Xiangjuan had only been frozen in time by the terrifying laws of space-time. Her life was not in danger. Of course, if Yao Xiangjuan and the others remained like that, they would be no different from being dead. However, in Zhuowen's opinion, that was much better than being dead. Since their lives were not in danger, it was possible for them to recover. However, it was basically impossible for them to come back from the dead. By the way, Senior, what's the trial you mentioned before? Zhuowen suddenly asked. The head sneered. I'd advise you not to set your sights on the space-time key. The trial on the space-time key is not something a brat like you can pass. You might even lose your life when the time comes. With that, the head said earnestly, Come back when you're stronger. At that time, I'll directly teleport you here for you to undergo the trial. However, Zhuowen shook his head and said, Senior, I'm determined to obtain the space-time key this time. I can't afford to lose it. Zhuowen knew very well that the reason why the mysterious head was suddenly so concerned about him was because it wanted to rely on Zhuowen to retrieve its left eye and heart. This time, the space-time key was closely related to the mysterious head. If Zhuowen did not take advantage of this relationship, he would really be a blockhead. The head's eyes narrowed slightly. He was no fool and naturally knew what Zhuowen was planning. However, it didn't care. The only thing it cared about was its missing left eye and heart. The white-clothed young man in front of it was the only person who knew the whereabouts of its left eye and heart. Naturally, it wouldn't miss such a good opportunity. If Senior can help me obtain the space-time key, Junior is willing to go through fire and water to obtain Senior's left eye and heart. Zhuowen cupped his fists. The head's gaze relaxed, but it quickly became serious. The space-time key is not under my control. It was left behind by the master of the space-time temple. The trial was also set up by the master of the space-time temple. Even the entire river of space-time quicksand was created by the master of the space-time temple. If I was at my peak, it would be possible for me to break through the methods of the temporal temple's master and help you obtain the temporal key. Unfortunately, in my current state, when the mysterious head said this, it laughed at itself and shook its head. Its eyes were filled with helplessness. Zhuowen sighed inwardly. Although he had guessed that the mysterious head did not have absolute control over the space-time key, he did not expect that the mysterious head would be completely useless. Thinking of this, Zhuowen secretly admired the master of the space-time temple. He was certain that the master of the space-time temple was definitely a Tao-proving realm expert. Moreover, he was one of the more powerful Tao-proving realm experts. When the mysterious head saw the dimness in Zhuowen's eyes, it immediately snorted coldly and said, Do you think I'm completely useless to the space-time key? If that's what you think, then you're gravely mistaken. Zhuowen's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly said, Senior, can you help me obtain the space-time key? The mysterious head said indifferently, You'll have to rely on yourself. However, I can suppress a portion of the trial's power and make it less difficult for you to enter. That way, your chances of passing the trial will be much higher. Zhuowen's expression was calm. He knew that the mysterious head would not help him out of the kindness of its heart. There was definitely a condition, and Zhuowen could roughly guess the condition. As a condition of the deal, you need to find my left eye and heart for me in the future and swear an oath to the heavenly Tao. If you break the oath, may the heavens and earth destroy you. Your soul will be destroyed, and you will never be able to reincarnate. When the mysterious head said this, it looked at Zhuowen, and a faint killing intent emanated from the head. Then, like a raging wave, it began to grow stronger and stronger. In the end, it was all applied to Zhuowen. Zhuowen was barely able to resist this killing intent, and his countenance was pale like snow, while his entire body trembled. He was very clearly aware that this mysterious head was forcefully pressuring him, and if he didn't tactfully agree this time, then this mysterious head would definitely not let him off. Don't worry, Senior. I agree to your condition. Zhuowen clasped his fist. Before a terrifying expert like the mysterious head, Zhuowen did not dare to play any tricks. Instead, he agreed without hesitation. Only after Zhuowen agreed did the terrifying killing intent from the mysterious head gradually recede. Zhuowen sighed gently. I'll give you 100 years. If you don't bring my left eye and heart in 100 years, I think you know the consequences." The mysterious head sneered. The mysterious head laughed coldly. Soon after, a bloody glow flashed in its eyes. Soon after, it drew a complicated array in the air and imprinted it on Zhuo Wen's forehead. Zhuo Wen could not resist at all. The mysterious head was far stronger than him. Even if he wanted to resist, the aura of the mysterious head suppressed him to the point that he could not move at all. He could only passively accept the blood-red formation drawn by the mysterious head. When the blood-red array formation entered his forehead, Zhuo Wen knew that this was a seal that the mysterious head had placed on him. For the next 100 years, he, Zhuo Wen, would be completely fine. However, if he still did not come looking for the mysterious head after 100 years and did not bring back the left eye and heart as promised, then Zhuo Wen's death would come. When the blood-red formation was completely imprinted in the depths of Zhuo Wen's sea of consciousness, Zhuo Wen slowly opened his eyes. His gaze was as calm as an ancient well. He was not as angry as the mysterious head had imagined. "You have a good temperament." The mysterious head gave a rare compliment. "You want to see me roar in anger? So what if I'm angry? Will you remove the seed you planted in me?" Zhuo Wen said indifferently. The mysterious head snickered and said, "So you're going to accept your fate?" Zhuo Wen shook his head and said, "I'm not accepting my fate. I'm just acknowledging our cooperation. Since we're working together, even if you didn't plant the seed in me, I would still bring back your left eye and heart. Of course, since you want to plant the seed in me, it's only natural to have an extra layer of protection." Chapter 23-21. Comprehension. Let's cut the crap. "Senior, please give me some pointers on the trial of the space-time key," Zhuo Wen said indifferently. The mysterious head nodded and stopped talking nonsense. Instead, it looked at the bottom of the cliff and said indifferently, "The space-time key is buried at the bottom of the cliff. When you dig out the bottom of the cliff, the trial will begin. However, I have to tell you that the trial is very dangerous. If you fail, you will end up like these people. You will be frozen in time forever, like a living dead." As it said that, the mysterious head looked at the area where time was frozen like a world of ice and snow. The cultivators there were frozen in time. "Let's begin." Zhuo Wen did not want to waste time, so he interrupted the mysterious head. The mysterious head was not annoyed. It quietly watched Zhuo Wen head to the bottom of the cliff. When Zhuo Wen's right hand landed on the bottom of the cliff, he immediately sensed that the bottom of the cliff possessed the laws of space and time that caused him to tremble in fear. It was like a storm that poured down on him. The power of the laws of space-time was extremely powerful. It was far more powerful than the other areas of the ocean. Under the influence of the laws of space-time, Zhuo Wen felt like every inch of his skin and flesh was constantly dislocated. It was as if he would collapse at any moment. Don't resist. This is the suction force that will bring you into the trial. The more you resist, the stronger the suction force will be. When the time comes, you might be torn to pieces by the suction force. Just as Zhuo Wen was struggling to resist the sudden suction force, the mysterious head's voice slowly echoed in Zhuo Wen's mind. Zhuo Wen took a deep breath when he heard that. He completely gave up resisting, and the power of the laws of space-time flowed into Zhuo Wen's body. Afterward, Zhuo Wen discovered that the power of the laws of space-time did not bring him the pain he expected. Instead, there was a trace of comfort, and he disappeared from the spot. When Zhuo Wen opened his eyes again, he discovered that everything before him had changed greatly. There was no longer the ocean before him, nor was there a cliff buried at the bottom of the sea. There was no bloody mysterious head. What appeared before Zhuo Wen was an extremely long plank road. The plank road was completely made of wood. Below the plank road was the boundless ocean. Moreover, the ocean was gray, which made it look particularly strange. Zhuo Wen's gaze fell on the end of the plank road. The plank road extended into the depths of the ocean. At the end of the plank road was a red sunset. The warm glow of the sunset sprinkled on the horizon, adding a trace of color and vitality to the originally lifeless gray ocean. Walk on the plank road and comprehend the sunset that is about to disappear. Otherwise, you will never be able to leave this place. An indifferent voice slowly resounded through the world. The voice was very unfamiliar, completely different from the voice of the mysterious head. Zhuowen knew that the owner of the voice was someone else. Furthermore, it was very likely that it had been left behind by the so-called master of the temporal temple. Zhuowen pondered for a moment. The moment the voice that resounded in the world faded away, he took large strides forward. Zhuowen's speed was neither fast nor slow. He did not forcefully increase his speed for the sake of speed. Instead, he ran forward as if he was chasing after his life. Just like that, Zhuowen walked on the plank road for 10 days. However, during these 10 days, it was as if Zhuowen was walking on the spot. Let alone comprehend the sunset, it was impossible for him to even approach it. On the contrary, it was more like he was walking on the spot. Zhuowen did not panic. He had encountered this situation in the ocean before. This was a trial stage set up by the master of the temporal temple. The laws of space-time here were much stronger than in the ocean. Back then, Zhuowen's laws of space-time had not reached the threshold, so he could only gradually lose himself in the ocean. It was only when he reached the threshold of the laws of space-time that he finally approached the sunset and arrived at the edge of the heartbroken cliff. However, the laws of space-time here were much more terrifying. If Zhuowen did not want to lose himself here, he could only further comprehend the laws of space-time. Only by absorbing the power of the laws of space-time could Zhuowen fight poison with poison. Zhuowen sighed softly. In the end, he took out the space-time force that he had fused with the laws of space and time on the heavenly armor continent. Although his laws of space-time had reached the threshold, it was simply impossible for him to obtain the space-time force. At least for the time being, it was unlikely that Zhuowen would be able to obtain the space-time force. However, Zhuowen now possessed the sliver of space-time force he had obtained on the heavenly armor continent. Coupled with the fact that Zhuowen had already reached the threshold of the laws of space-time, Zhuowen was able to use the sliver of space-time force much more easily. Zhuowen continued forward this time, and the sliver of space-time force lingered around him at all times. With the protection of the sliver of space-time force, Zhuowen found that the space-time suppression of this place was no longer so powerful and terrifying. Zhuowen continued forward. The plank road was no longer as illusory and vague as before. Instead, it was real. At least now, Zhuowen was constantly moving forward, constantly approaching the sunset at the end. When Zhuowen finally reached the end of the plank road, Zhuowen had already become an old man with a head full of white hair. He had sunk into his twilight years, just like the beautiful sunset floating above the sea, about to fall and disappear. Zhuowen had a feeling that if the setting sun at the end of the horizon really fell, his life would end just like the setting sun. That mysterious head said that I have to comprehend the sunset when I enter this place, but it didn't ask me to comprehend the laws of space-time. Zhuowen seemed to have caught on to something as he secretly considered what the mysterious head had said to him. His gaze was fixed on the beautiful sunset at the end of the horizon as he gradually fell into a state of absent-mindedness. And the moment Zhuowen came to the end of the plank road, the originally motionless sunset began to slowly fall. Although it was very slow, Zhuowen could feel that the sunset was indeed falling. At this speed, he would probably be completely submerged in the sea very soon. Zhuowen sat down cross-legged. He stared at the setting sun in a daze, but his heart was extremely calm. Even though he could clearly sense that his life was gradually fading away as the sun set in the west, he was still calm. When the sunset finally fell into the sea and the entire sea sank into darkness, Zhuowen slowly closed his eyes. His vitality was completely severed as if he had completely died with the sunset. The endless darkness lasted for a long time. Then, at the end of the darkness, a rising sun appeared again. This rising sun was filled with vigor and vitality, as if it was fearless. At the end of the plank road, a figure silently sat cross-legged. This was a figure that could not be any older. The moment the sun rose, the white-haired old man suddenly moved. He slowly raised his head and looked at the rising sun as an indescribable emotion appeared at the corner of his mouth. The true power of space-time is hidden in this sunrise and sunset. Chapter 23-22. The waning sun. At sea the sun rose and set, and the sun came and went. On the vast surface of the sea, a boundless plank road stretched out at the end of the sea. At the end of the plank road, a figure with a straight back sat quietly with his legs crossed. Regardless of whether the sun rose from the east or the setting sun set in the west, the figure sat there motionlessly, as if he had passed away. The only change was that between sunrise and sunset, the hair that draped over his shoulders constantly changed between black and white, as if he was returning to his youth and returning to his old age. Zhuowen sat quietly at the end of the plank road. He seemed to have forgotten how long he had been sitting there. He only knew that his life force was constantly being created and destroyed between sunrise and sunset. This feeling was not pleasant. However, Zhuowen knew that this was the only way he could fully comprehend the setting sun hanging high above the sea. Another setting sun slowly set from the sea. When this setting sun was almost halfway below the sea, Zhuowen suddenly stood up. A poem involuntarily appeared in his mind. A setting sun spreads across the water. Half the river is red. Half the river is red. Just as he finished reciting, Zhuowen waved his sleeve. Immediately, the setting sun that had fallen below the sea stopped at this moment. Setting sun on the sea, time and space. Zhuowen muttered in a low voice, as if he had caught on to something. The understanding in his eyes became even more intense. On the surface of the sea, sunrise and sunset represented the passage of time, and also the movement of space. The usual sunrise and sunset became so profound and mysterious in Zhuowen's eyes at this moment. Zhuowen waved his sleeve again, and the originally still setting sun slowly fell below the surface of the sea. In the end, the entire sea fell into darkness. Zhuowen sat cross-legged in the darkness, but his eyes emitted a frightening light. The rising sun rose at sunrise, and the setting sun set at sunset. This was the law of nature. Zhuowen, on the other hand, wanted to do the opposite. When the sun rose, the setting sun would rise, allowing the beauty of the sunset and the vitality of the sunrise to combine together. The energy produced by such a clash would be extremely terrifying. Of course, all of this was Zhuowen's imagination. When he had first entered this place, the voice had said something ambiguous, telling him to comprehend the setting sun. There were no specific requirements for comprehending the sunset. Zhuowen knew that the key was to comprehend it. No matter what you comprehended, as long as you could comprehend something from this beautiful sunrise and sunset, Zhuowen knew that you would be able to leave this place. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen began to use the sliver of space-time force in his body. He knew that although there was not much space-time force, Zhuowen had a little grasp of the space-time law, so he could unleash the strongest power of the sliver of space-time force. Thinking up to here, Zhuowen's right hand formed a sword finger and suddenly pointed out in the air. Instantly, waves of mysterious energy actually suffused out from the area around his fingertips, spreading out in circles. At the very front of the plank road, the dark sea suddenly erupted with endless splashes of water. Following that, the splashes of water began to condense and soar into the sky, as if something was about to break out from the bottom of the sea. The splashes of water became more and more violent. Following that, a ray of light overflowed from the dark sea. The light was not intense, but it had a kind of beauty to it. Asterisk splash. Asterisk finally, the light became even more exuberant. The surroundings were dyed dark red, and a huge setting sun slowly rose from the sea. The setting sun emitted a red light, and the afterglow dyed the white clouds in the sky red, making the white clouds in the sky look like they were on fire. It was dazzling and wonderful. Zhuowen looked at the setting sun that rose again, and there was a sense of excitement and heroism in his heart. He knew that after sitting for countless days, he had finally comprehended the true essence of the setting sun and relied on the space-time force to create his own divine ability. It should be known that a self-created divine ability was much more powerful than a divine ability learned from others. This was because a self-created divine ability was completely compatible with one's body and could unleash its greatest power. Moreover, a self-created divine ability could be used continuously as one's cultivation base increased, and its power would continue to increase. It could be used continuously, and it would not be eliminated. After all, as Zhuowen continued to cultivate and improve, he could continuously perfect the power of the self-created divine ability, making it more compatible with him. In the future, this divine ability will be called the ocean's waning sun. The corner of Zhuowen's mouth revealed a trace of a happy smile. He had always wanted to create a divine ability of his own, but how could it be so easy to create a divine ability? If it weren't for the trial arranged by the space-time temple's master, Zhuowen wouldn't have been able to comprehend this divine ability through the space-time force. The moment the setting sun rose to its highest point, the vast sea under the setting sun suddenly boiled, and terrifying giant dragons appeared. It was as if 10,000 dragons were rushing out of the sea. The scene was extremely spectacular. Zhuowen stood on the plank road with his hands behind his back. His eyes revealed a smile as he quietly admired the raging sea. He was very satisfied with the power of the ocean's waning Sunday. He knew that once this divine ability was used, it would be enough to fight against a half-step, void sky ninth-step cultivator. Moreover, as Zhuowen's comprehension of the space-time law deepened, the power of his divine ability would only become stronger and more terrifying. At that time, he believed that it would be comparable to the void sky ninth step heavenly Tao law. This is the bottom of the sea? When the endless seawater went crazy because of the setting sun, the bottom of the sea gradually emerged. Zhuowen's gaze involuntarily fell on the bottom of the sea. When he saw the sparkling and translucent crystals exposed on the bottom of the sea, his eyes suddenly became blazing and excited. This was because these crystals were all time and space crystals. These two kinds of crystals were extremely rare in the time and space law areas, but there were actually countless of them at the bottom of the sea. They were like countless pebbles in a stream, densely packed together. There are so many time and space crystals. Zhuowen's eyes burned with passion. Without even thinking, he flew down, and his divine sense transformed into a giant hand that reached the heavens, grabbing at the crystals without hesitation. Zhuowen's speed of grabbing the crystals was extremely fast. Each time, he would grab hundreds or thousands of crystals. However, there were too many crystals here. Compared to all the crystals on the bottom of the sea, the crystals he grabbed were simply a drop in the ocean. When the setting sun gradually disappeared, the raging sea water calmed down again, and the exposed bottom of the sea was completely submerged by the sea water. Zhuowen returned to the plank road before the sea calmed down. Zhuowen's face was slightly pale. The ocean's waning sun consumed a lot of his energy. This time, he had just comprehended this divine ability, so he could only use it once at most. He couldn't use it continuously. Chapter 23:23. Frog-headed monster. It would be perfect if I could get all the crystals at the bottom of the sea. Zhuowen sighed with some regret. Of course, all of this was just Zhuowen's fantasy. The number of crystals at the bottom of the sea had reached a terrifying level. Even without the obstruction of the sea, Zhuowen would probably need a few months to collect them all. However, Zhuowen was quite satisfied with the harvest this time. In just a short period of time, Zhuowen had collected over 10,000 crystals. If this was in the outside world, it would cause a huge sensation. I've already comprehended my own divine ability. This trial should be considered passed, right? Zhuowen took out a praying mat. After recuperating for a while, He stood up again and looked around at the quiet sea. He frowned slightly. He felt that the surroundings were too quiet. There was no movement at all. Splash! Just as Zhuowen was puzzled, an extremely ear-piercing sound of water suddenly appeared on the calm sea surface. Then a huge whirlpool appeared on the surface of the water 1,000 miles in front of the plank road. This whirlpool was dark, and it was impossible to see what was inside. Zhuowen stood on the plank road and silently looked at the whirlpool in the water. After waiting for a while, he found that there was no creature or monster coming out of the whirlpool. He frowned and muttered to himself in a low voice, "Could this be the entrance to a certain place?" Zhuowen's guess was not without reason. After the whirlpool appeared in the water, Zhuowen clearly felt that there was a teleportation power in the whirlpool. Clearly, this whirlpool was a teleportation array. However, Zhuowen was hesitant about whether he should enter the whirlpool or not. After waiting for a while, Zhuowen confirmed that this whirlpool was indeed not dangerous. He took a step with his right foot and jumped into the depths of the whirlpool. Soon he disappeared inside. After Zhuowen disappeared into the whirlpool, the eyes of the mysterious head in the outside world flickered. Its gaze landed on a figure in front of it. This figure was emitting a strange glow. Not bad. To think that he would be able to comprehend the laws of space-time. This fellow is much stronger than those trash from before. Although I have lowered the difficulty of the trial by a little, it was still not easy to pass. For this kid to be able to pass, it goes to show how strong his talent is. The mysterious head mumbled to itself, and the figure that its gaze fell upon was actually Zhuowen. However, at this moment, Zhuowen landed not far away from Yao Xiangjuan. His surroundings were frozen by ice. He was motionless, and his expression was serene. Clearly, Zhuowen was also frozen in time. However, the only difference between him and the others was that his body emitted a strange light, while the others did not. The mysterious head knew that this light represented that Zhuowen's soul had not yet been lost in the trial. Once this child was completely lost, the strange light would also disappear, and Zhuowen would never be able to return. This time, what entered the trial was not Zhuowen's physical body, but Zhuowen's soul. The mysterious head did not tell Zhuowen this. It knew that if it told Zhuowen, it would only cause the latter to have more worries. Thus, it might as well keep it from Zhuowen. After entering the trial, Zhuowen's soul would leave, but his physical body would be frozen in time for eternity. Only if he passed the trial would the time freeze disappear. At that time, Zhuowen would also completely obtain the space-time key. Zhuowen opened his eyes and found that he was still on a plank road in front of him. The surroundings were misty white, but Zhuowen knew that this plank road should also be built in a sea. This was because he heard the sound of crashing water and waves. Zhuowen did not know where this place was, but he knew that the only thing he could do now was to move forward. He knew that the road ahead would definitely have the answer he wanted. This place also had the space-time constraint, but it did not have much effect on Zhuowen now. After all, he had comprehended a part of the space-time law and also had a trace of the power of space-time. He had also created the sun waning above the sea. The space-time constraint had long lost any effect on him. After Zhuowen slowly disappeared into the fog, a head poked out from under the plank road where Zhuowen had just been. This head looked like a frog with a pair of round eyes. It stared in the direction that Zhuowen had left and sneered, "Another one has come to die. This guy's soul looks quite delicious. Perhaps Sir will like it. I'll go inform him first." After saying that, the monster slowly dived into the water and left. Zhuowen walked for 3 hours and finally found that the surrounding fog had gradually thinned out. At the same time, he noticed that in the distance he saw the outline of an island. Looking at the outline, the island was not big, but Zhuowen smelled an ominous premonition from the island. Boom! 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 Suddenly, there was the sound of water splashing, and then a series of fierce black shadows swept toward Zhuowen at an extremely fast speed. Zhuowen took a deep breath and immediately took out the Emperor's sword. The Emperor's sword in his right hand abruptly swept out, and in an instant the sword light turned into a waterfall that connected the heavens and the earth. It actually laid across Zhuo Wen's body, turning into a revolving barrier. Bang! 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 A series of sounds like hailstones were heard, and then Zhuo Wen discovered that these black shadows were actually fist-sized ice cubes. To be more precise, these were not ice cubes, but fist-sized water droplets frozen at a certain point in time by the space-time law. These water droplets contain the space-time law, and if one was hit by them, it would not feel good. Zhuo Wen swung his sword again and again, barely managing to block the ice that fell like raindrops. His gaze also noticed his surroundings, and he discovered that numerous heads had emerged from the surface of the sea. They were densely packed together. These heads were very strange. They were shaped like frog heads, and their fan-like palms grabbed the seawater around them and threw it towards Zhuo Wen. Zhuo Wen blocked the falling ice cubes around him, but his eyes revealed a look of shock. He knew very well that the sea below the plank road was eternally frozen at a certain point in time by the space-time law, just like ice cubes. No creature could travel through such seawater, and basically all of them were frozen at the bottom of the sea. However, these countless frog-headed monsters that appeared in front of him not only traveled through the sea, but also grabbed the frozen seawater and threw it at him. How could Zhuo Wen not be shocked? Fortunately, these frog-headed monsters were not strong, and there were no energy fluctuations on their bodies. It seemed that they only knew how to use brute force. However, Zhuo Wen did not dare to be careless because these monsters had a natural advantage. Their bodies contained the space-time law, so they could freely travel through this strange sea and use the space-time water to attack. If an ordinary cultivator was hit by so much space-time water, they would undoubtedly die, but Zhuo Wen was not so bad. After all, he had comprehended a part of the space-time law. At most, he would be a little embarrassed. Sword Dragon slashes the sky. Zhuo Wen knew that if he kept defending, he would lose, so he had to take the initiative to attack. Otherwise, these monsters would definitely exhaust his strength. Zhuo Wen swung his sword, and suddenly the soaring sword chi intertwined with each other and condensed into a huge dragon above Zhuo Wen. Chapter 23-24. Island Boom. Boom, boom, boom. The sword dragon swept out with a terrifying aura. The attention of the frog-headed monsters, who were originally focused on Zhuo Wen, was immediately diverted by the sword dragon. Then, some of the frog-headed monsters immediately grabbed the space-time seawater around them and threw it at the sword dragon. In less than 10 breaths, the imposing sword dragon was completely defeated by the attacks of the frog-headed monsters. Zhuo Wen knew how powerful the frog-headed monsters were, so he naturally did not place his hopes on the sword dragon. His main purpose was to attract the attention of the frog-headed monsters, and he had achieved his goal. Zhuo Wen waved his right hand, and immediately the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword were summoned. As soon as the two divine swords appeared, under Zhuo Wen's signal, they rushed out and swept toward the distracted frog-headed monsters. As for the space-time rules here, although it affected the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword, Zhuo Wen used time and space crystals to refine a simple formation and arranged it on the two divine swords. Therefore, although the space-time rules could affect the two divine swords, it was not to the extent of making it difficult for the two divine swords to move. Puchi! Puchi! The Thunder Fire Sword and the Blood Immortal Sword grasped the timing just right. Before the frog-headed monsters could recover from their focus on the sword dragon, the two divine swords began to kill them. For a moment, blood splattered everywhere, and the frog-headed monsters were killed by the two divine swords. Their blood flowed like a river. The two divine swords immediately attracted the attention of the other frog-headed monsters, who were attacking Zhuo Wen. Then the frog-headed monsters roared angrily and threw the space-time seawater in their hands at the two divine swords, trying to stop the two divine swords from killing. Zhuo Wen's mouth revealed a mocking smile. After the rest of the frog-headed monster's attention was attracted by the blood-immortal sword and the thunder-fire sword, his burden was immediately relieved. Soul kill! Zhuowen growled, and his consciousness immediately scattered countless needle-like objects, which then turned into rain and fell densely. In an instant, more than half of the frog-headed monsters were killed by soul kill. The remaining frog-headed monsters reacted quickly and immediately dove into the sea to avoid the disaster. Zhuowen looked at the calm sea and smiled. He put away the blood-immortal sword and the thunder-fire sword and walked toward the island along the plank road. When Zhuowen arrived near the island, he finally got a clear view of the island. The island was not big, and it was full of bony rocks. At a glance, it was impossible to see any green plants. The entire island was lifeless and lifeless. Zhuowen's divine sense was extremely powerful. Although he was still some distance away from the island, his divine sense had already swept into the island, allowing him to see the whole picture of the island. There's actually someone here. Zhuowen raised his eyebrows. Just now, when his divine sense entered the island, he actually found 3 people on the island. These 3 people were all men. 2 of them were younger, and the last one looked like a middle-aged man in his 40s. However, Zhuowen found that these 3 people were sitting in the stone hall, drinking to drown their sorrows. They looked extremely dispirited. Third brother, how long have we been trapped here? The middle-aged man picked up a jug of wine and looked at the black-clothed young man who was holding his cheek and asked with drunken eyes. The black-clothed young man looked at the middle-aged man and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Big brother, I don't know how long we've been trapped here. I only know that it's been so long that I don't have any concept of time." The blue-clothed young man, sitting opposite the middle-aged man, picked up a jug of wine and took a big gulp. Then he threw the jug on the ground, his eyes full of determination. "I don't want to be a coward anymore. Big brother, third brother, there are only 3 of us left on this island. Are we going to be cowards like this forever?" The blue-clothed young man said with a murderous look. The middle-aged man said bitterly, "Second brother, don't be so impulsive. Are you going to face that monster? You know, once we're killed by that monster, we'll die directly. Our souls and divine souls will be annihilated. There's no chance of survival. But what's the difference between this and death? I'd rather die than live like a coward." After the blue-clothed young man finished speaking, he took a step forward and rushed toward the plank road outside the island. However, the blue-clothed young man didn't rush out for long before he was stopped by the middle-aged man and the black-clothed young man. "Second brother, don't be impulsive. We still have hope. As long as a monster enters the trial and successfully passes it, then we'll be saved. If you rush out now, you'll only be throwing your life away. Even if someone passes the trial in the future, you won't have a chance to live," the middle-aged man advised earnestly. The black-clothed young man also hurriedly advised, "Second brother, big brother is right. We can only continue to wait. It's not worth it for you to go out and throw your life away." On the plank road, Zhuowen's eyes flickered. From the words of the 3 people, Zhuowen heard a lot of information. It seemed that the 3 of them were trapped here, and the 3 of them seemed to be very afraid of the things on the plank road. However, there were only those frog-headed monsters on the plank road. These frog-headed monsters were nothing to Zhuowen, so why were the 3 of them so afraid? Moreover, the strength of the 3 of them wasn't bad. If they were able to enter the island before, then they must have fought with these frog-headed monsters. There was no need to be so afraid, right? Splash! Just as Zhuowen was walking and pondering about the 3 people on the island, a thunderous sound of water breaking came, and then a huge shadow appeared on the left side of the plank road. The shadow jumped out, and then countless space-time water droplets rushed out, turning into water arrows that rushed toward Zhuowen. Zhuowen's eyes changed, and an ominous feeling suddenly arose. He immediately took out the Emperor's sword, and a sword light burst out, turning into a thick barrier. Unfortunately, the barrier didn't last long before it completely collapsed. Zhuowen had no choice but to take out the phagocytosis. The phagocytosis immediately grew to a size of 100 feet, like a unique, huge rock, blocking in front of Zhuowen and blocking all the water arrows. At this moment, Zhuowen discovered that the thing in front of him was a huge frog-headed monster. This frog-headed monster was much bigger than the ones he had encountered before. It was 1,000 feet in size. Zhuowen stood in front of this frog-headed monster, as if he was facing a mountain. He seemed insignificant and unreachable. Whoosh! 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 The moment this huge frog-headed monster appeared, small frog-headed monsters immediately drilled out of the surrounding sea. These frog-headed monsters looked at Zhuowen with strong killing intent. Obviously, Zhuowen had killed so many of their companions that these frog-headed monsters completely hated him. Chapter 23-25. Temporal Frog King, what's going on? The Temporal Frog King has appeared. Could it be that a new challenger has appeared? The three of them looked at each other in dismay. Soon after, joy appeared in their eyes as they rushed out of the island and arrived at its edge. Soon after, the three of them saw a white-clothed young man standing on a plank road a few thousand meters away from the island with a huge phagocytosis floating in front of him. Opposite the white-clothed young man was a huge frog-headed monster and a group of smaller frog-headed monsters. What did this guy do? Normally, the Temporal Frog King won't appear when challengers enter the first island. Only those who plan to return the way they came and fail will attract the Temporal Frog King. The middle-aged man's gaze changed slightly as he looked at the huge Temporal Frog King. His body trembled slightly as he muttered in a low voice. Obviously, he was extremely afraid of the Temporal Frog King. It's only the Void Sky 7th step? With such a weak cultivation, this kid will definitely die. The black-clothed man shook his head and said helplessly. On the other hand, the blue-clothed man held a wine pot in his hand as he silently looked at the white-clothed young man standing with a sword. He saw supreme confidence in the white-clothed young man. This temperament could only be possessed by a true powerhouse. The white-clothed young man's cultivation wasn't high. He was only at the Void Sky 7th step. But he actually had such a temperament. Clearly, this kid wasn't simple. I'll go help him, the blue-clothed man said as he leaped out and left the island. He was so fast that the middle-aged man and the black-clothed man couldn't react at all. Second brother, you! The middle-aged man was as anxious as an ant on a hot pan. He also wanted to follow, but after looking at the huge Temporal Frog King and the densely packed temporal frogs around it, the impulse in his heart immediately calmed down. Whoosh! Whoosh! The arrival of the blue-clothed man immediately attracted the attention of the Temporal Frog King and Zhuowen. Zhuowen looked at the blue-clothed man in surprise. How could he not see that the blue-clothed man had come to save him? He didn't expect that there would be such a warm-hearted person in the cold and ruthless world of cultivators. Friend, I am Xiaolang. This Light Frog King is not easy to deal with. Xiaolang is not talented, so I will lend you a hand. Before the man in blue could finish speaking, the sound of something breaking through the air could be heard. The time frogs covering the Time Frog King throughout space-time water droplets at the man in blue. The expression of the blue-clothed man changed drastically. With a flick of his finger, he took out a long spear. He held the handle of the spear with both hands and suddenly swung it. Immediately, many spear shadows rushed out and blocked all the water droplets that were thrown over. Zhuowen took a deep look at the blue-robed man. This guy was very strong. He was definitely an expert at the peak of the Void Sky 8 steps. Boom! Unfortunately, the blue-clothed man had just blocked that attack when an even more ferocious attack came rushing over from behind. For a moment, the pressure on the blue-robed man increased greatly. Cold sweat dripped down his forehead, and his face turned pale. Thank you, Brother Xiao. You should go back first. I will deal with this Light Frog King. Zhuowen smiled slightly. Xiaolang's eyes flickered. Just as he was about to speak, a space-time water droplet broke through his defense and fiercely smashed into his chest. Then, Xiao Lang let out a muffled groan and was sent flying. At the same time, the following space-time water droplets swarmed over and smashed into Xiao Lang's body. The space-time water droplets were too terrifying. If so many space-time water droplets smashed into his body, Xiao Lang knew that he would die without a doubt. Second brother, you are too impulsive. With an explosive shout, the middle-aged man standing on the shore had unknowingly rushed to Xiao Lang's side. Then, the middle-aged man's right hand formed a palm and fiercely blasted out. Boom! 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 An incomparably huge red palm rushed into the sky and blocked the space-time water droplets. The middle-aged man let out a muffled groan and spat out a mouthful of blood before bringing Xiao Lang to the shore. Pucci! After the middle-aged man put down Xiao Lang, he knelt on one knee on the ground and madly spat out blood. His face was extremely pale. Big brother! Xiao Lang crawled up from the ground and immediately went over to the middle-aged man's side to help him up, and his face was covered in shame. The middle-aged man shook his head to indicate that he was fine, and then he said in a low voice, Second brother, you are the strongest amongst us in terms of strength and natural talent. You have the best chance of leaving this place, so I can't allow you to die. Don't do anything stupid. When he spoke up to here, the middle-aged man gazed at the white-clothed young man with a complicated expression and said, There's no need to pay any attention to him. His cultivation is too low, unless he is able to comprehend the energy of the spatial laws. Otherwise, the middle-aged man shook his head. Obviously, he didn't believe that Zhuowen was able to comprehend the energy of space. The three of them had been trapped here for so long, yet none of them had been able to condense even a trace of the energy of space, let alone Zhuowen, who just entered this place. Big brother is right. Second brother, you can't give up. The black-clothed man hurriedly came over to Xiao Lang's side and persuaded. Xiao Lang sighed lightly and sat dejectedly on the ground. He'd suffered a great deal of injuries just now, but his face was slightly red, and he didn't dare look at the white-clothed young man. Earlier, he'd solemnly vowed to save this young man, yet now he'd been pulled back by his big brother. So those words of saving the young man were no different than a fart, and he was slightly unable to swallow his pride. Of course, he was even more unwilling to watch the white-clothed young man be killed by the Temporal Frog King before him. The Temporal Frog King glanced indifferently at Xiao Lang's group of three, and then it paid no further attention to them, and its enormous eyes descended onto Zhuowen. You're really bold. You actually killed many of my disciples. How do you want to die? The Temporal Frog King's voice was deafening like thunder. Xiao Lang's group of three came to an understanding when they heard this. No wonder this kid would draw out the Temporal Frog King. It turned out that this kid had killed many temporal frogs. If this kid hadn't killed the temporal frogs and had merely charged through, the Temporal Frog King would absolutely not have appeared. Unfortunately, this kid didn't do that. However, this also caused Xiao Lang's group to have a whole new level of respect for him. Although the temporal frog's strength was far inferior to the Temporal Frog King, they'd always appeared in groups. This wasn't easy to deal with, let alone kill many temporal frogs. Yet, this white-clothed young man was able to do it. Obviously, this white-clothed young man wasn't a simple person. Of course, although Xiao Lang's group of three thought highly of Zhuowen, they still didn't think that Zhuowen could survive the Temporal Frog King's attack. The terror of the Temporal Frog King had long been deeply imprinted in their minds after being trapped here for so long, and they were unable to extricate themselves from it for a long time. Zhuowen naturally didn't know what Xiao Lang's group of three were thinking. He stood with his sword in hand, and a phagocytosis floated above his head. He looked indifferently at the Temporal Frog King and said, Your disciples wanted to kill me. Could it be that I'm not allowed to retaliate? You're right. It doesn't matter if my disciples and grand-disciples kill you. However, it won't do if you kill my disciples and grand-disciples. The reason for that is because they are my disciples and granddisciples. The Time Frog King spoke with overflowing, killing intent. Zhuowen sneered and said, "Are you that great? I feel that continuing to speak to a fellow who's about to die under my sword is simply a waste of time." Chapter 23:26. Divine power displayed. The Temporal Frog King was so angry that he laughed. He felt that the white-clothed young man in front of him was too arrogant. "Kill him!" The Temporal Frog King roared angrily. The temporal frogs around him threw out space-time water droplets, which bombarded Zhuowen. Zhuowen looked calm as he waved the Emperor's sword in his hand. At the same time, the Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword turned into two streamers of light and floated beside Zhuowen, helping Zhuowen resist the dense space-time water droplets. For a moment, the two sides were in a stalemate. "Humph, you really have some skills." The Temporal Frog King sneered. He bounced his legs and jumped out of the water. Suddenly, thousands of waves surged out of the calm sea. It looked extremely spectacular. The lower jaw of the Time Frog King suddenly bulged, and then it spat out a huge water ball that was 1,000 feet in size from its mouth. The water bomb was extremely terrifying. The moment it was blasted out, the entire space-time sea began to distort and deform. The water bomb contained even more terrifying space-time rules. Boom! The water bomb blasted the phagocytosis. Then the phagocytosis, which had an amazing defense, was blown away by the water bomb. It was on the verge of collapse. Obviously, it could not hold on for long. Bang! 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 The phagocytosis was on the verge of collapse under the attack of the water bomb. Obviously, the Temporal Frog King wanted to follow up with another attack. He once again bulged his lower jaw and spat out another water bomb. Boom! The phagocytosis was finally blown away by the attack of the two water bombs. The Blood Immortal Sword and the Thunder Fire Sword saw that the situation was not right and hid behind Zhuowen. After Zhuowen cursed the two guys, he immediately spat out a mouthful of blood on the phagocytosis. Suddenly, the power of the phagocytosis increased greatly. It barely blocked the attack of the Temporal Frog King. However, the Temporal Frog King's attack was too terrifying. Coupled with the attacks of the surrounding temporal frogs, Zhuowen immediately fell into an absolute disadvantage. He was suppressed and could be in danger at any time. The Temporal Frog King is too terrifying. This kid can't hold on for long. On the shore, the middle-aged man shook his head and sighed. His eyes were full of pity. He saw Zhuowen's battle just now and knew that the white-clothed young man in front of him was very powerful. But he was still no match for the Temporal Frog King. Xiao Lang's eyes were filled with guilt. Just now, he had solemnly vowed to help the white-clothed youth. But now he could only watch as the white-clothed youth died at the hands of the Time Frog King. Boom! The Time Frog King was right in front of Zhuowen. Its gigantic palm leaf, fan-like palm, suddenly whizzed over and blasted toward Zhuowen. Gusts of violent wind swept up a terrifying storm, setting off huge waves that were like raging dragons. Translation Frog Translation. Translation Translation Translation. Zhuowen of Translation Translation. Of Translation Translation Translation. Is that he, it that frog that was that it? Realm. Was. The Temporal Frog King lived in the sea of time and space. If he wanted to hurt it, he would have to use the power of space-time law. Although Zhuowen had mastered a part of space-time law and his attack carried a small amount of space-time law, it only had some effect on the Temporal Frog King. It didn't have much effect on the Temporal Frog King. Waning sun of the sea. Zhuowen stood in place and looked at the palm that was getting closer and closer. Then he pointed his right finger at the void. Suddenly, with Zhuowen as the center, an invisible energy ripple radiated out. Then the whole space seemed to have come to a standstill. The Temporal Frog King's palm also came to a complete stop at this moment. Whoosh! The seawater behind Zhuowen soared into the sky, forming countless water pillars. Then, behind the water pillars, a waning sun slowly rose. The red light reflected the sea and the sky, forming a rare and beautiful scene. Boom! 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 The moment the waning sun rose, the Temporal Frog King's palm exploded. Terrifying energy swept out, causing the Temporal Frog King to cry out and retreat repeatedly. Moreover, as the waning sun continued to rise, the power became more and more terrifying. The Temporal Frog King's huge body kept exploding, and blood spurted out like rain. It looked extremely miserable. It wasn't just the Temporal Frog King. Wherever the waning sun shone, terrifying energy would set off. The densely packed temporal frogs all exploded into clouds of blood mist under the power of the waning sun. When the waning sun rose to the highest point, the Temporal Frog King wailed, and its huge body exploded into a huge cloud of blood mist. In the end, its face was blurry, leaving only an incomplete corpse floating on the sea. This, Xiaolang and the other two, who were standing on the shore, were stunned as if they had been struck by lightning. They stared blankly at the unbelievable scene in front of them. The Temporal Frog King was killed just like that. Wasn't it too simple? In the beginning, the Temporal Frog King was suppressing the white-clothed young man. Now it was killed in the blink of an eye. Moreover, it was done so cleanly that the three of them couldn't even react. That's a divine ability that contains the laws of space-time. Could it be that this kid created it by comprehending the laws of space-time? Xiaolang was the first to react. He stared at the white-clothed young man with awe and murmured in a low voice. Not only Xiaolang, but the middle-aged man and the black-clothed man beside him also showed fear and awe. However, there was also a trace of excitement in their awe. The fact that the white-clothed young man in front of them possessed the divine ability of the laws of space-time meant that this kid was likely to pass the trial smoothly. At that time, the three of them might be rescued. After killing the Temporal Frog King, Zhuowen was panting and his face was quite pale. He could only use the waning sun at the sea once. After using it, he would become very weak. He could only use it again after he slowly recovered. Zhuowen sat cross-legged on the plank road. He was not in a hurry to go to the plank road. Instead, he asked Xiaohei and the blood celestial sword to guard him while he focused on recuperating and recovering his divine power. One must always be on guard against others. Although Xiaolang and the other two didn't look like villains, they had never met Zhuowen before. Therefore, Zhuowen naturally couldn't just walk over like that. He had to wait until he recovered first. Xiaolang and the other two naturally couldn't go forward rashly. Zhuowen's behavior had already indicated that they couldn't get close at the moment. Therefore, the three of them stood on the shore and waited silently. For hours later, Zhuowen's divine power recovered a little. He immediately stood up and walked toward the shore. "Thank you, brother." When Zhuowen walked to the shore, Xiaolang and the other two immediately cupped their hands and thanked him. Zhuowen looked surprised and said, "The three of you must have misunderstood. I didn't do anything for you. Why should I thank you?" Xiaolang quickly explained, "Brother, you don't know. The Temporal Frog King has been guarding outside the island. It doesn't allow cultivators to leave the island. Once they leave the island, they will be killed by the Temporal Frog King." Chapter 23-27. The checkpoint Zhuowen was startled. Then he asked, "You want to go back the way you came?" Xiaolang nodded and said yes. "Back then, we accidentally entered this training ground. This was our first stop, but after entering this island, we no longer had enough strength to continue forward. So we want to go back the way we came and leave this place." Zhuowen narrowed his eyes and said in a deep voice, "I am Zhuowen. I am new here, so I don't know much about this place. Can the three of you tell me more about this place?" When the three heard this, they looked at each other. In the end, Xiaolang smiled and said, "Of course. I don't think anyone who can enter this place is an ordinary person. Actually, it's like this." Zhuowen listened to Xiaolang in silence. He had a rough understanding of this place. Xiaolang and the other two were three brothers. They were also famous loose cultivators in the Six Desires heavenly domain. Xiaolang was the second brother. His eldest brother was called Xiaoyin, and his third brother was called Xiaofu. Among the three of them, Xiaolang had the highest talent and strength. His strength had reached the peak of the 8 steps void sky. When the three Xiao brothers heard that there was a part of the space-time wheel in the river of space-time quicksand, they naturally wanted the space-time wheel. They entered the depths of the river of space-time quicksand and finally arrived at the base of the cliff in the depths of the sea. After they entered the base of the cliff, they also encountered the mysterious head. However, the mysterious head did not talk nonsense with the three of them. It only said that if they wanted to obtain the space-time key, then they should go back to the training ground. The three of them did not even have time to react. Their bodies were eternally frozen at a certain point in time, and their souls were transported to this training ground. They came to this island in the first checkpoint, but when they wanted to pass the next checkpoint, they found that they did not have enough understanding of the space-time law. It was impossible for them to pass the second checkpoint. Therefore, they stayed on this island for thousands of years. It was so long that they almost lost track of time. At first, there were many other cultivators here. A small number of cultivators comprehended the power of the space-time law and successfully passed the second checkpoint and left this place. Most of the other cultivators could not bear the loneliness of this place and wanted to go back the way they came. Unfortunately, it was easy to enter, but difficult to leave. Once one intended to leave the island, the Time Frog King would appear and wipe out all the cultivators who intended to leave. In the end, the cultivators on the island either left or died. In the end, only the three brothers were left. Even so, the three brothers were on the verge of collapse. If it wasn't for Zhuowen's appearance, Xiaolang would have probably gone to the Time Frog King to seek death. After listening to the three brothers, a puzzled look appeared on Zhuowen's face. Based on what the three of them had said, it seemed like they had arrived in this space the moment they entered the trial grounds. They hadn't entered the place where Zhuowen had comprehended the setting sun. However, Zhuowen had entered that strange space and comprehended a space-time divine ability that belonged solely to him. Could this have been arranged by the mysterious head? He also found out from the three of them that it was his soul that had entered this place, not his physical body. Although it was his divine soul that entered this trial space, this space was very strange. He could use the divine weapons in his spiritual ring and his own divine abilities, and it would not affect his strength. Are you planning to go back the way you came? Zhuowen asked with a frown. Yes, Brother Zhuo. Is there a problem? Xiaolang said with a smile. With all due respect, when I entered this space, I couldn't even distinguish the entrance. If you go back the way you came, I'm afraid. Zhuowen didn't finish his sentence, but he knew that Xiaolang and the other two should know what he meant. Sure enough, Xiaolang and the other two looked at each other helplessly. Then Xiaolang cupped his fists and said, Thank you, Brother Zhuo, for reminding us. It seems that we have to continue waiting. Speaking of this, Xiaolang looked at Zhuowen with a burning gaze. When Zhuowen used the sun waning above the sea, he could feel that this white-clothed young man in front of him was very likely to pass this trial. He had seen many cultivators who had entered this trial, but it was the first time he had seen someone who could create their own space-time divine ability. Brother Zhuo, the strength of this place is mostly determined by the depth of your understanding of the space-time law. Although you are only at the void sky 7th step, you have created your own space-time divine ability. You are much stronger than the three of us. Speaking of this, Xiaolang said excitedly, Brother Zhuo, maybe you can be the first person to pass this trial. Zhuowen's expression was calm. He didn't show any complacency because of Xiaolang's praise. Instead, he said in a deep voice, Before we pass, I hope that Brother Xiao can tell me in detail everything you know about this trial space. This time, Zhuowen mainly came for the space-time key. If he wanted to get the space-time key, he had to pass this trial. Although he had the help of the mysterious head, Zhuowen wanted to succeed, so he naturally wanted to know more. After all, know yourself and know your enemy, and you will never be defeated. Actually, it's like this. There are a total of 3 stages in this trial. This is only the first stage. There are 2 more stages after that. Moreover, every stage has a corresponding reward. Moreover, the further you go, the more generous the rewards are, Xiaolang quickly said. Reward? Zhuowen looked at Xiaolang in confusion. Xiaolang smiled and said, Brother Zhuo, don't worry. You have passed the first stage, so you will naturally have a corresponding reward. When the time comes, go to the center of the island, and the reward will be there. This is the reward given by the trial space, and it is different for everyone. It is said that the reward will be given based on the performance of the challenger. The better the performance, the more generous the reward. With Brother Zhuo's previous performance, I think the reward will definitely be extraordinary. Zhuowen nodded in understanding. It seemed that when the time came, he would have to go to the center of the island to have a look. He wondered what kind of reward this trial space would give him. When the challenger passes the 3 stages, it is said that they will obtain the space-time key. The space-time key is a good thing. I only learned about it after I was teleported here. It turns out that such a good thing as the space-time key was hidden in the river of space-time quicksand. Speaking of this, Xiaolang's eyes were full of excitement. It was obvious that he had a strong desire for the space-time key. Hearing this, Zhuowen sighed softly. It seemed that in the 6 Desires heavenly realm, there was basically no one who knew that the space-time key was in the river of space-time quicksand. Thinking about it, if the news of the space-time key were to spread, it would attract the interest of many old monsters. Even the cultivators of the Void Sky 9 Steps would come out. The river of space-time quicksand would not be so deserted, and a mere quicksand family would not be able to protect such a precious place like the river of space-time quicksand. Where is the entrance to the 2nd stage? Zhuowen suddenly asked. Xiaolang was startled and immediately said, It is also in the center of the island. However, the 2nd stage is more humane. Even if the challenger is not strong enough, as long as they do not die in the stage, they can return to the 1st island. The 3 of us have already tried several times, but we have all failed. When they spoke up to hear, the 3 brothers sighed dejectedly. Zhuowen nodded and said, Take me to the center of the island. Chapter 23-28. Rewards in the center of the island. Zhuowen stood in front of a stone pillar. This stone pillar was blood red in color, and its surface was engraved with many patterns. It was at least 1,000 feet tall. Brother Zhuo, this stone pillar is the key to the 2nd checkpoint. However, Brother Zhuo, you just fought with the Time Light Frog King, so it's best that you don't try the 2nd stage yet. You can choose your reward first, Xiaolang said. Zhuowen nodded. He had consumed a lot of energy in the battle with the Time Frog King, and he had only recovered a little. Naturally, he couldn't rashly challenge the 2nd stage. Zhuowen followed Xiaolang's instructions and stared at the blood-red imprint on the surface of the stone pillar. Soon after, 2 blood-red rays of light shot out from the blood-red imprint and were reflected in Zhuowen's eyes. Not long after, a secret chamber appeared at the bottom of the stone pillar. Zhuowen squinted his eyes and looked at the secret chamber. However, there was a force on the surface of the secret chamber, and Zhuowen's spiritual consciousness could not penetrate it. Whoosh! Whoosh! Instantly, black shadows flew out of the secret pavilion and floated in front of Zhuowen. Zhuowen looked at the things in front of him with a strange expression. These black shadows were actually broken parts. Upon closer inspection, they were probably parts of a spacecraft. Furthermore, Zhuowen also sensed an extremely rich space-time law aura from these parts. Furthermore, this aura was much richer than the space-time sea. It's a part of the space-time roulette. He actually gave out dozens of parts at once. It seems that Brother Zhuo's performance is really good this time. When Xiao Lang and the other two saw the piles of components floating in front of Zhuowen, their eyes revealed shock and envy. One had to know that when they had just passed the first level, they had also received their rewards here. However, the three of them had only received fragmented parts, and they were very small in size. They could not be compared to any of the parts in front of Zhuowen. On the other hand, Zhuowen had obtained dozens of components in one go. How could the three of them not be moved? Space-time roulette? Zhuowen murmured. He had heard of this item from Yao Xiangjuan before. It was said to be the fastest flying divine artifact. However, it was later shattered by several mighty figures. Who would have thought that this fragment would actually fall here and be used as a reward? Brother Zhua, the components of the space-time roulette are good stuff. Naturally, they contain the laws of space-time. If you can refine these components into a flying ship, its speed will definitely be unparalleled. Of course, if you can make it into a space-time hollow, its speed will definitely be even faster. At the very least, most flying-type divine artifacts will not be able to compete with it, Xiao Lang said with a smile. Zhuowen nodded and said in a deep voice, "Could it be that the rewards for the next stages are all related to the space-time roulette?" Xiao Lang nodded and said, "Indeed. The most important one is the space-time core. It is said that the space-time core is in the third trial. Only if you perform well enough will you be able to obtain the space-time core. Moreover, there are only 2 space-time cores. As for whether they have been obtained by others, I do not know." Xiao Yin interrupted and said, "Regardless of whether you can obtain it or not, if you can't get out, wouldn't it be useless to obtain the space-time core?" Big Brother is right. No matter how precious the treasures are, what's the point of being trapped here? Are you going to wait for death while guarding a pile of treasures? The black-clothed man agreed. Xiao Lang smiled and looked at Zhuowen with a burning gaze. He said, "Brother Zhua, little brother Zhua, you were able to comprehend the laws of space-time and kill the space-time Frog King. From this, it can be seen that you are not ordinary. Perhaps you can successfully pass through the third trial. You should know that the space-time Frog King's strength is about the same as the second trial's guardian." Zhuowen understood what Xiao Lang meant. The space-time Frog King would not normally appear. Once it did, it would definitely be a disaster for the cultivators on the island. Its strength was also about the same as the second trial's guardian. Since he was able to kill the space-time Frog King, he would naturally be able to deal with the second trial's guardian. Xiao Yin and Xiao Fu's eyes also revealed a fervent look. They had been waiting for a powerful monster to appear and completely break through this trial ground. That way, they would have hope of being rescued. As for the white-clothed young man before them, it was clear that they had high hopes for him. "Do the 3 of you want to follow me to the second trial?" Zhuowen asked Xiao Lang's team of 3. The second trial was more humane. As long as they were not killed, they would be able to retreat and their lives would not be in danger. Additionally, Xiao Lang's team of 3 were not bad people. Zhuowen had a good impression of them. Thus, he was willing to bring them to the second trial. Of course, Zhuowen had another purpose, and that was that the number of cultivators at the second checkpoint shouldn't be too small, and there should be people that Xiao Lang and the others were familiar with. When the time came for him to enter, he would be able to save some breath. "Brother Zhua, you are willing to bring us along?" Xiao Lang's eyes were filled with excitement. However, they quickly dimmed, and he said solemnly, "Brother Zhua, I fear that is not appropriate. The difficulty of this trial increases according to the number of people. The more people there are, the more difficult it will be. Back then, there were quite a number of cultivators on the island. We had joined forces to break through, but we suffered heavy casualties." Hearing this, Zhuowen frowned slightly. It seemed that the person who set up the trial had already thought of this situation. "It doesn't matter. We can give it a try first. If it doesn't work, we can retreat at that time," Zhuowen said. Xiao Lang's team of 3 looked at each other and saw the excitement in each other's eyes. Although they were quite worried that the difficulty of the trial would increase, they believed in Zhuowen's strength more. Brother Joie, regardless of whether you can bring us through the second trial this time, the three of us brothers are very grateful to you." Xiao Lang cupped his fists towards Zhuowen. Then he took out a jade talisman from his bosom and handed it to Zhuowen. "This is—" Zhuowen took the jade talisman and asked in surprise, "This jade talisman belongs to a friend of mine. He is a skilled weapon refiner. I saw that Brother Joie obtained a lot of parts of the space-time roulette. It is completely possible to refine a small roulette. If Brother Joie can pass the second trial, then you can look for my friend. Of course, if this Xiao is lucky enough to pass the trial under the guidance of Brother Joie, this Xiao will personally bring Brother Joie to my friend." Xiao Lang laughed. Zhuowen was surprised. He did not expect Xiao Lang to have a weapon refiner friend. He could not help but ask, "Then, who is better at weapon refining, your friend or Kuang Li of the Quicksand family?" Xiao Lang sneered. "Brother Joie, Kuang Li's weapon refining level can only be said to be above average. That Kuang Li can only act like a tyrant in the Gulen Galaxy. In the entire Six Desires Heavenly Realm, his weapon refining level is nothing. But my friend is different. Even in the Six Desires Heavenly Domain, his armor-making skills are top-notch. Back then, the Six Desires Palace even wanted to invite my friend to be their royal armor-making Grandmaster, with the same treatment as the law enforcement elder of the Six Desires Palace, but my friend refused." Zhuowen was shocked. If Xiao Lang's words were true, then this friend of his was really amazing. Generally, the law-enforcing elder of a sect was a person of high status and authority. The law-enforcing elder of a behemoth like the Six Desires Palace had the power to cover the sky with one hand. Chapter 23-29. "Sam, thank you, Brother Xiao." Zhuowen cupped his hands in gratitude. Xiao Lang waved his hands repeatedly, saying that he didn't dare. Next, Zhuowen recuperated on the island. He hadn't fully recovered yet, so he planned to challenge the second checkpoint after he recovered. Moreover, Zhuowen also discovered that the space-time rules on this island were easier to accept and comprehend. During the time he stayed on the island, he actually naturally understood many of the space-time rules that had previously troubled him. Half a month later, Zhuowen had completely recovered. When Zhuowen walked out of the cave, he discovered that Xiao Lang and his two brothers were already waiting by the stone pillar. "Brother Joie, as long as you place your hand on the stone pillar, will be teleported to the second checkpoint. Be careful at that time," Xiao Lang said solemnly. Zhuowen nodded and walked in front of the stone pillar. He stretched out his right hand and placed it on the surface of the stone pillar. Xiao Lang and his two brothers followed closely behind him. A blood-red light burst out from the stone pillar and enveloped the three people beside it. What appeared in front of Zhuowen was still a sea, but this sea was blood-red. However, it still contained a rich aura of the space-time rules. Above the blood-red sea, there was a long white jade bridge. If one looked carefully, the end of the white jade bridge led to another island. This island was obviously different from the first one because this island was covered in white snow. At a glance, it was a beautiful scene of ice and snow. Zhuowen, Xiao Lang, and the other three stood at the other end of the white jade bridge. "Brother Joie, you have to pay attention to the seawater. The blood-red color on the surface of the seawater is a terrifying creature. We've been here before, so we know how terrifying this blood-red color is." Xiao Lang pointed at the blood-red color under the bridge and said in a frightened voice. Zhuowen nodded. With a wave of his sleeve, he threw out 81 beast bone array discs and set up a powerful defensive array in an instant. "Be careful and follow me closely." After Zhuowen finished speaking, he took a step forward and flew towards the white jade bridge. The 81 beast bone array discs were constantly revolving around Zhuowen. Waves of array fluctuations spread out, indicating that the beast bone array discs around him were unusual. Xiao Lang and the other two followed closely behind Zhuowen. All of them took out their respective divine artifacts and were secretly on guard against the blood-red color under the bridge. Along the way, it was exceptionally quiet under the white jade bridge. The surface of the sea was even more tranquil. However, the more it was like this, the more vigilant Zhuowen and the others became, and their footsteps became even faster. Rumble! The moment the four of them walked to the center of the white jade bridge, the surface of the sea under the bridge suddenly exploded. Then, waves of blood rushed out from the surface of the sea and gathered in the air, finally forming a strange human figure that was dozens of feet tall. This strange human figure was made up of blood. Its appearance was like mud, and from time to time, a red, sticky substance would drip from its body. It looked exceptionally disgusting. The strange humanoid figure did not have clear facial features. The two bloody holes in its head were like two intelligent eyes. "This is the guardian." Zhuowen frowned slightly. He took a few steps back and turned to look at Xiaolang and the other two. Xiaolang and the other two's faces were deathly pale. Their eyes were filled with deep fear, and their lips trembled. Zhuowen realized that something was wrong and hurriedly asked, "What's wrong with you?" Xiaolang calmed down. He took a deep breath and said with a trembling voice, "Brother Zhua, we're in big trouble. The guardian of the second checkpoint is called Sam. This thing is a soft-bodied creature. Usually, it basically lives on the surface of the space-time sea. It floats on the surface of the sea and stains the seawater red. When the challengers come, Sam will condense a corporeal body to obstruct them. Sam has thousands of forms. They can generally be divided into 3 types: plant, animal, and human. Among them, the plant form is the weakest, while the human form is the strongest and most terrifying. Back when we were challenging this checkpoint, Sam only showed his plant form. After Xiaolang said that, Xiao Yin continued, "Even if Sam was in his plant form, we were no match for him. Back then, when we formed a group of over 10 people to challenge this checkpoint, Sam only showed his animal form. His strength was extremely terrifying. 10 of us were killed, and only a few of us managed to escape. As for his human form, this is the first time I've seen it." Hearing that, Zhuowen nodded. He finally understood why Xiaolang and the other 2 were so afraid of Sam. It turned out that Sam was so terrifying. Furthermore, he had shown an unprecedented human form. Sam's empty eyes did not look at Xiaolang and the other 2. Instead, they fell on Zhuowen. He said in a low voice, "Did you kill the Temporal Frog King?" Zhuowen was startled. Soon after, he said indifferently, "Yes." "So what?" "Haha, to be able to kill the Temporal Frog King, you're pretty good. However, I'll kill you. Although the Temporal Frog King and I weren't on good terms, we were still fellow sufferers trapped in the same place. Since you killed him, I have to avenge him. Otherwise, he would have died too unjustly." Sam's voice was hollow and hoarse. It sounded exceptionally ear-piercing. "I don't think the Temporal Frog King needs you to avenge him, because you'll be able to meet him very soon." Zhuowen pulled out the Emperor's sword and said in an indifferent voice. Sam grinned. "You're quite stubborn. I wonder how long you can be so stubborn." After saying that, Sam took a step with his right foot. Like a bolt of lightning, he disappeared from where he stood. By the time Sam reappeared, he was already within reach. Rumble! Sam clenched his right hand into a fist and slammed it in front of Zhuowen. Immediately, the 81 beast bone array discs around him burst out with violent ripples, resisting Sam's terrifying fist energy. Zhuowen's eyes narrowed as he looked at the beast bone array discs that were constantly trembling. Sam's strength was indeed extraordinary. With just a single punch, he was able to cause the defensive array set up by the beast bone array discs to tremble so much. Boom! Boom! Sam roared furiously, throwing out punch after punch like a madman. His punches were so fast that it was shocking. Every punch created a series of fist shadows. The fist shadows also contained extremely terrifying space-time rules. When he threw out a punch, space and time seemed to freeze. Xiaolang and the other two were aghast. They trembled in fear, and their legs went soft. They didn't dare to make a move. The three of you stay in the array. I'll go meet this Sam. Zhuowen glanced at the frightened Xiao Lang behind him. He knew that the three of them wouldn't be of any use. So he took a step forward and jumped out of the defensive array. Die. Sam's eyes were sharp and his hands were nimble. He suddenly punched out at an extremely fast speed, directly toward Zhuowen's chest. Chapter 2330. Human Form Rumble. The fist force collided with the sword force, causing a ring-shaped shockwave to erupt. Instantly, pillars of water shot out from the surface of the sea like raging dragons. The power of the laws of space-time spread out like a raging storm. On the other end of the white jade bridge, the faces of Xiaolang and the other two, who were protected by the beast bone array disc, changed slightly as bitter smiles appeared at the corners of their mouths. The collision between Zhuowen and Sam was truly terrifying. Even though they were so far away, the shockwaves from the laws of space-time that spread out caused them to tremble in fear. Brother Zhuo has become stronger. His utilization of the laws of space-time is also much stronger than before. Xiaolang could not help but sigh as a look of admiration appeared in his eyes. The trial grounds are meant to improve your comprehension of the laws of space-time. Back then, before we entered this trial grounds, we only had a smattering of knowledge of the laws of space-time. However, after entering the island of the first stage, our understanding of the laws of space-time improved considerably by relying on the laws of space-time within the island. As for Brother Zhuo, before entering the island, his grasp of the laws of space-time was already far above the three of us. After staying on the island for a while, it is only natural that he has a deeper understanding and utilization of the laws of space-time. A look of awe appeared in Xiaoyin's eyes. They knew that, aside from the rewards, the most important thing about the island was that the laws of space-time within the island were gentler compared to the laws of the outside world, making it easier to comprehend. Generally speaking, cultivators who could enter the island would be able to gain a certain amount of benefits. The amount of benefits would depend on the cultivator's perception and talent. Xiaolang and the other two knew that even if they stayed on the island for a long time, they would not be able to pass the second stage. However, Zhuowen was different. Before entering the island, he had killed the Temporal Frog King. Now that he had been baptized by the gentle laws of space-time within the island, it was only natural that his grasp of the laws of space-time would be even stronger. Boom! 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 The more Zhuowen and Sam fought, the more ferocious they became. Terrifying shock waves spread out, causing the white jade bridge on the other end to shake violently. It was as though it would collapse at any moment. At the other end of the bridge, there were two cultivators sitting cross-legged. The two cultivators who were meditating suddenly opened their eyes as if they had sensed something. A tall and thin cultivator looked at the chubby cultivator opposite him and said, "Did you hear anything?" The slightly plump cultivator's gaze turned solemn as he noticed the white jade bridge in front of him. He said in a deep voice, "The bridge is shaking. Furthermore, I can sense an extremely powerful fluctuation of the space-time law in the distance. Someone is trying to break through there." The tall and skinny cultivator nodded. His eyes flickered as he said, "We have been guarding the bridge for hundreds of years under Ancestor Lu's orders. This is the first time we have seen the bridge shake so violently. Should we go over and take a look?" The fat cultivator frowned slightly and said with some hesitation, "Ancestor Lu has given orders before that we must not leave our posts without permission. Otherwise, we will have to bear the consequences. Do you intend to go against Ancestor Lu's orders?" The thin and tall cultivator said disapprovingly, "Ancestor Lu is in seclusion most of the time. How can he pay attention to small characters like us? We are just going to take a look, not to cause trouble." The slightly plump cultivator was tempted. In fact, he also wanted to go over and take a look. However, he recalled Ancestor Lu's orders and had some misgivings. Now that the tall and skinny cultivator had said this, his misgivings were greatly reduced. The slightly plump cultivator said with some concern, "All right, but we'd better go over quietly. If there is anything wrong, we'll immediately retreat. That Sam of the second trial is not to be trifled with." The tall and skinny cultivator chuckled and said, "Don't worry. Can't you see that the bridge is shaking so violently? That Sam must be fighting the challengers right now. I wonder what form Sam will use to fight." The lanky cultivator chuckled. The slightly plump cultivator said with interest, "I have only seen Sam's plant form and animal form. It is said that Sam has a final form, human form, but I have never seen it." The tall and skinny cultivator said with some trepidation, "That Sam is indeed terrifying. We were lucky and only encountered that guy's plant form, but even in that form he almost killed us." The slightly plump cultivator said with some reverence, "You're right. Sam's animal form is very terrifying. However, I heard that when Ancestor Lou broke through the second trial, Sam's human form was also drawn out. Furthermore, Ancestor Lou smoothly passed through Sam's obstruction and successfully reached the second island." The tall and skinny cultivator shrugged and said, "Don't you know what kind of person Ancestor Lou is? He should be the most promising existence to enter the third island. I don't find it strange that he passed through Sam's obstruction in human form." The slightly plump cultivator nodded and agreed with the tall and skinny cultivator's words. On the second island, Ancestor Lou was the leader and the most powerful person on the island. There were almost no cultivators on the second island who dared to disobey Ancestor Lou. "We're almost there. The battle is over there." The tall and skinny cultivator suddenly stopped and stared ahead with vigilance. On the long bridge, thousands of meters ahead, two figures were constantly fighting. The aftermath of the battle spread out and caused endless waves to rise on the sea below the bridge. It was an extremely terrifying scene. The tall and skinny cultivator's eyes narrowed and immediately noticed a blood-colored figure among the two fighting figures. He frowned and said, "That figure can't be Sam, right? This form? I have never seen it before." The slightly plump cultivator trembled and said, "Of course you haven't seen it before, because this is his human form. Oh my God, someone actually encountered Sam's human form and even fought him to a standstill. Is this guy a freak?" The tall and skinny cultivator was taken aback and shock appeared in his eyes. He also saw Sam's human form, and then his gaze fell on the white-clothed youth who was fighting Sam. Who is this person? He's so strong. With this kid strength, he doesn't need to be entangled with Sam at all and can immediately pass through the bridge. The tall and skinny cultivator said in surprise. The slightly plump cultivator's gaze fell on Xiaolang and the other two, who were quite far behind the white-clothed youth, and said in a deep voice, "This person brought 3 people here. If he wants to take them away, he must defeat or kill Sam. Otherwise, he won't be able to pass through the bridge at all." The tall and skinny cultivator reacted and also noticed Xiaolang and the other two on the other side. He was speechless and said, "This person is too kind. With this strength, he can just pass by himself, but he still wants to take care of others. Isn't he asking for trouble? Although this kid is not weak, I don't think he can last long. Sam's human form is very terrifying, and he hasn't used his ultimate move yet." Chapter 2331. Difficult to deal with, Zhuan's gaze became more and more solemn. Sam was really strong, even stronger than the Time Frog King. Ever since Zhuan cultivated on the second island for a while, he naturally went through the baptism of the space-time law on the first island, which made his mastery of the space-time law even stronger. But now he found it more difficult to deal with Sam than he did with the Time Frog King. This was something he didn't expect. The power of the waning sun over the sea was really terrifying. If Zhuan used it now, he could seriously injure or even kill Sam. However, Zhuan didn't feel particularly at ease with Xiaolang and the other 2. Moreover, during the battle just now, he also noticed the tall and thin cultivator and the slightly fat cultivator coming from the other side of the bridge. He knew that these 2 people were cultivators from the second island. Without knowing whether they were friends or foes, he really did not want to expose the sun of waning life on the sea. After all, he would become extremely weak after using this sun of waning life on the sea. Boom! Just as Zhuowen was pondering, Sam roared and suddenly punched out. The fist wind rushed over, followed by a thick, blood-red mucus that blasted in front of Zhuowen. Zhuowen flipped his left hand and summoned the phagocytosis, which blocked the mucus that splashed over. At the same time, the fist wind blasted over and smashed into the phagocytosis. Bang! Zhuowen groaned and was forced back by this huge force. His gaze became extremely gloomy. This Sam was really incredible. The more he fought, the stronger he became. Seeing Zhuowen being forced back, Sam roared and punched out again. This punch was powerful and heavy, carrying a terrifying power that could penetrate the heavens. Even Zhuowen's expression changed. Zhuowen spat out a mouthful of blood essence onto the phagocytosis and immediately activated the power of the Tao rhythm within the phagocytosis. At the same time, Zhuowen summoned the everlasting ice lotus, and a terrifying cold energy bloomed like a lotus flower. The phagocytosis contained the heavenly Tao of the Tao fruit, and the ice lotus contained the ice essence. These 2 treasures were extremely rare in the outside world, so it was easy to imagine how terrifying their combined might would be. Rumble! As the fist energy blasted out, the surrounding air surged, filling the air with terrifying ripples. However, the combination of the phagocytosis and the everlasting ice lotus barely blocked this attack. Moreover, the extreme ice and the everlasting ice lotus froze all of Sam's attacks in place. At this moment, the torch dragon wings on Zhuowen's back suddenly unfolded. He took a step forward with his right foot and disappeared on the spot. The moment Zhuowen reappeared, a dense sword light appeared and swept out. He had been waiting for Sam to make a mistake, and this was definitely his most powerful strike. Sam's expression changed slightly. He had been too careless. He didn't expect that Zhuowen would have such a precious treasure like the everlasting ice lotus. Although this freezing cold qi had only frozen his right fist for about a breath of time. Although the ice only froze his attack for a moment, it was enough for an expert like Zhuowen to send out hundreds and thousands of sword attacks. Puchi! When Sam's right fist finally broke free from the frozen state, the endless sword light rained down on Sam's body. Then Sam's entire body was cut into 8 pieces, into countless small pieces. At the same time, Zhuowen waved his right hand, and the everlasting ice lotus floated above Sam. A terrifying cold energy swept out like a wave, freezing all the pieces of flesh. The moment the flesh was frozen, phagocytosis fell from the sky and smashed all the ice into powder. Zhuowen was still not satisfied. He bent the king's sword in his hand and swung it. Suddenly, with Zhuowen as the center, a terrifying spatial crack appeared. The shattered ice fell into the spatial crack and was completely annihilated. Zhuowen looked at the powder that disappeared into the spatial crack, and his gaze relaxed slightly. Before coming to this checkpoint, Xiaolang had already told him about Sam's characteristics. He knew that Sam's vitality was very strong. If he couldn't get rid of him by the roots, Sam would basically be immortal. This was also the main reason why Zhuowen had used such a combo after seizing the opportunity. This guy is so strong. I'm afraid he's as strong as Ancestor Lu, right? The thin and tall cultivator said in shock. The fat cultivator frowned slightly and said in a deep voice, "That's not necessarily true. Ancestor Lu passed through here many years ago. Do you think Ancestor Lu hasn't taken a single step forward all these years? In my opinion, this kid is very strong, but there's still a gap between him and Ancestor Lu." The thin and tall cultivator nodded and didn't refute the fat cultivator's words. He knew that the fat cultivator had seen Ancestor Lu's battle and knew better than him how terrifying Ancestor Lu was. Since he said that Ancestor Lu was stronger than this kid, it should be true. However, what shocked the thin and tall cultivator was that the white-clothed youth in front of him was a newcomer who had just entered the second checkpoint, but he had already killed Sam. This strength definitely couldn't be underestimated, and his talent was definitely above Ancestor Lu's. As long as this kid was given time, it wouldn't be too big of a problem for him to surpass Ancestor Lu. Xiaolang and the other two were ecstatic. They rushed to Zhuan's side and asked about his well-being excitedly. Pucci! Suddenly, the thin and tall cultivator, standing not far away, spat out a mouthful of blood and then fell to the ground, spitting out blood from his mouth. Judy, what's wrong with you? The fat cultivator was startled and quickly pulled up the thin and tall cultivator and asked. Unfortunately, the thin and tall cultivator's eyes turned white and he lost consciousness. He just kept spitting out blood. The fat cultivator quickly let go of the thin and tall cultivator and couldn't help but retreat again and again, looking at the strange condition of the thin and tall cultivator with fear in his eyes. Could it be? The fat cultivator seemed to have thought of something, and cold sweat kept flowing down his forehead. Then he didn't dare to stay here any longer and left the place in a flash. What's wrong with that guy? Xiaolang also noticed the strange condition of the thin and tall cultivator not far away and couldn't help but ask in surprise, You guys retreat first. Zhuowen looked at the thin and tall cultivator not far away, but his eyes were filled with bewilderment because he felt an extremely familiar and terrifying aura from the thin and tall cultivator. This aura was too similar to Sam's that he had just killed. Boom! After Xiaolang and the other two retreated a few hundred meters, the thin and tall cultivator exploded. A bloody mist sprayed out and dyed the white jade bridge blood red. Then the bloody mist began to condense and squirm, and in an instant it formed a strange blood-colored human figure. And this blood-colored human figure was no stranger to Zhuowen. It was Sam. I was too careless. I didn't expect you to be hiding a trump card. But now I won't be careless again. Today you will die for me. Sam's resentful voice sounded, and then he rushed toward Zhuowen without caring about his own safety. Zhuowen's eyes were solemn. With a twist of his right wrist, the sword light turned into a huge dragon and rushed out, instantly enveloping Sam. Hee. Do you think I will be as careless as before? You are too naive. Chapter 2332. Passbang. Sam, who had turned into a puddle of blood, was extremely fast. In an instant, he slammed into Zhuowen's chest. Fortunately, Zhuowen reacted quickly and used the phagocytosis to block in front of him. Even so, when the puddle of blood slammed into the phagocytosis, a huge force was transmitted through the phagocytosis to Zhuowen's body, causing Zhuowen to let out a muffled groan and his face to turn slightly pale. Zhuowen once again used the Big Bang technique. A powerful spatial tearing force pervaded his body. Unfortunately, Sam was extremely cautious this time. Although the power of Heaven and Earthsplitter was powerful, Sam had fled in advance, causing Zhuowen's attack to miss. Bang! 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 The two once again engaged in a fierce battle. This time, Zhuowen was completely at a disadvantage. Even though he had the infinite ice lotus and the phagocytosis at the same time, he was still fiercely suppressed by Sam. Sam let out a light breath. He knew that the white-clothed youth in front of him should not have any more trump cards. Based on the current situation, Sam knew that it would not be long before this kid would be defeated by him. Rumble! A muffled sound like thunder rang out. Sam's fist was extremely crafty. Like a viper hunting for its prey, it swiftly swept out and ruthlessly struck Zhuowen's chest. This punch was too terrifying. The phagocytosis and the infinite ice lotus in front of Zhuowen were all blasted away. Under this heavy blow, Zhuowen fell onto the white jade bridge like a withered leaf, smashing a deep hole in the bridge's surface. Brother Joie, Xiaolang, and the other two watched with fear and worry in their hearts. Hee, kid, with your strength, it would not be difficult for you to pass my trial. Unfortunately, you are too arrogant. Not only did you want to bring those 3 pieces of trash over, you even tried to kill me. You really overestimated yourself. Sam crossed his arms and hovered in midair, looking down at the young man in white who was deeply embedded in the bridge. Sam was well aware of how terrifying his punch was. In his opinion, the white-clothed young man who had taken his punch head-on would be severely injured, even if he didn't die. Now, do you know how insignificant and useless you are? The corners of Sam's mouth curled into a smile, but his smile quickly froze because he discovered that there was a figure wriggling in the pit. The white-clothed youth who had been severely injured by him was actually slowly struggling to stand up. You're actually not dead yet. You're quite lucky. However, let's see if you can take my next punch, Sam snorted coldly. He bent his right knee and stomped on the ground. His entire body plummeted down like a meteor, and the direction his right knee fell just happened to be the head of the white-clothed youth in the deep pit. However, when Sam was about to approach the white-clothed youth, he discovered that there was an extremely terrifying restriction around him. This restriction was extremely terrifying. It was as if countless chains had sealed his limbs and bones. Sam wanted to move, but he found that he couldn't move at all. What's going on? Sam's eyes revealed a touch of fear. Zhuowen stood up shakily and smiled faintly. I didn't want to use this move at first, but unfortunately, you forced me to this point. Even if this move consumes a lot of energy, I'll still kill you. After saying that, Zhuowen raised his right hand and pointed at the void. Suddenly, the spatial restriction became more and more terrifying. Sam, who was the closest, felt it the most clearly. He clearly felt that this restriction wasn't just a spatial restriction, but also a freezing of time. Then, Sam saw a waning sun slowly rising behind Zhuowen. The moment this waning sun rose, the calm sea suddenly surged with waves tens of thousands of feet high, as if worshipping this waning sun that had just risen. Space-time law ability? How is that possible? It's impossible to comprehend a space-time law ability just by passing the first stage. When Sam saw the rising, waning sun, the fear in his eyes couldn't be erased for a long time. Sam finally knew why the Time Frog King died in the hands of this kid. It was because this kid had comprehended his own space-time law ability. In this trial space, space-time law ability was the fatal weakness of challengers. This kind of ability had an absolute suppression on them. Bang, bang, bang. As the waning sun rose, clouds of blood mist burst out from Sam's body. Countless blood-red mucus splashed out, looking extremely disgusting. I'm not willing. When the waning sun rose to its highest point, Sam roared at the sky. Then he was completely annihilated under the light of the waning sun. After killing Sam, Zhuowen's forehead was covered in cold sweat. His face was even paler. Even his body was shaking as if he would fall at any time. At this moment, Zhuowen was even weaker than when he fought the Time Frog King. After all, he was seriously injured by Sam before he used the waning sun over the sea. Now, after using the waning sun over the sea, Zhuowen's injuries would only worsen. Taking a deep breath, Zhuowen took out the heavenly domain starry sky essence from his spirit ring and slowly swallowed it. The injuries on his body instantly healed, but the fatigue in his spirit did not disappear. Although Zhuowen knew that he would not enter the trial space with his body, but with his spirit, this space was extremely magical. Although he only entered with his spirit, he could use and bring in the spirit ring and the things inside. Even the heavenly domain starry sky essence and other healing divine medicines were all effective. Anything that could be used in the outside world, his spirit could also use in this space. Brother Joie, are you okay? Xiaolang and the other two hurriedly came to Zhuowen's side, their faces filled with excitement. Sam's death meant that the 3 of them could enter the second island. I'm fine. I just consumed a lot of energy. Let me recover first. Zhuowen waved his hand, then immediately took out a futon, sat down cross-legged, and began to recuperate. In fact, after taking the Heavenly Domain Starry Sky Essence, Zhuowen's injuries were basically healed. The reason why he said so was to observe Xiaolang and the other two. If the three of them coveted the treasures on Zhuowen's body and launched a sneak attack while he was heavily injured, Zhuowen wouldn't mind eliminating the three of them. Whether it was the phagocytosis or the everlasting ice lotus, they were all supreme treasures in the outside world. These three were not blind. Naturally, they could see the preciousness of Zhuowen's phagocytosis and the everlasting ice lotus. However, Xiaolang and the other two didn't have any ulterior motives. Instead, they stood around Zhuowen and took the initiative to protect Zhuowen. Zhuowen secretly nodded in his heart. Half an hour later, he stood up and said lightly, "Let's go to the second island." The chubby cultivator stumbled back. When he reached the end of the bridge, he sat down on the ground and said with lingering fear, "Sam's human form was too terrifying. Judy was directly born by Sam's body. Fortunately, I ran fast enough. Maybe I would have been left there too." Thinking of the last miserable state of the thin and tall cultivator, the chubby cultivator only shuddered. Chapter 23:33. Valley the fat cultivator frowned slightly. He and the thin and tall cultivator were both guards of the bridge. If either of them had an accident, it would attract Ancestor Lu's attention. If he hid it and didn't report it, he would be severely punished. However, the two of them had violated the rules and entered the bridge. If the plump cultivator had told the truth, he would have been severely punished as well. After thinking about it, the fat cultivator thought of an idea. He looked deeply at the bridge and muttered, "Anyway, you guys are dead. It's not too much to let you guys be the scapegoat." After saying that, the slightly fat cultivator quickly left the bridgehead. Not long after the fat cultivator left, Zhuowen brought Xiaolang and the other two to the bridge. Zhuowen looked at the two cave mansions on the side of the bridge. His eyes revealed a contemplative look. He couldn't help but think of the thin and tall cultivator and the fat cultivator from before. It seemed that these cave mansions belonged to these two guys. As for the identity of these two guys, Zhuowen could completely guess. They must be guarding the bridge to prevent other dangerous creatures from the Sea of Time from invading. Zhuowen's guess was not wrong, but there was one thing he did not guess. The two cultivators guarding the bridge were indeed there to prevent the invasion of other dangerous creatures in the Sea of Time and Space. But at the same time, they also had another duty, and that was to register the new challengers. However, of the two guards, one was killed by Sam and the other went to report to Ancestor Lu, so they naturally missed Zhuowen, the newcomer. "Brother Xiao, do you know where your friend is?" Zhuowen turned to look at Xiaolang and asked. Xiaolang smiled and said, "Brother Zhuo, where's the jade talisman I gave you before?" Zhuowen took out the jade talisman from the spirit ring and handed it to Xiaolang. "It's here. This thing doesn't seem to be a communication jade talisman, right?" Xiaolang smiled and said, "This is indeed not a communication jade talisman, but a positioning jade talisman. This jade talisman contains my friend's aura. As long as the distance between the jade talisman and my friend is not more than 1,000 li, this jade talisman can accurately locate my friend's aura. Back then, when my friend left the first island, he left behind this jade talisman for me so that I can look for him when I enter the second island." As he spoke, Xiaolang's right hand formed a sword and pointed at the jade talisman in his hand. With a swoosh sound, the surface of the jade talisman emitted a gentle glow, after which the jade talisman floated in the air, chose a certain direction, and slowly flew off. "Looks like my friend is still on the island. Let's follow him." Xiaolang's gaze shook. He immediately followed the jade talisman. Zhuowen and the rest naturally followed closely behind. This was a cliff path with rows upon rows of rock walls on both sides. Moreover, this island was covered in ice and snow all year round. As Zhuowen and the other three walked, the sky was still constantly snowing, and the path beneath their feet was covered in thick snow. The path was winding and complicated. The four of them walked for about a quarter of an hour before finally walking out of the path. What appeared in front of them was an extremely large valley. This valley was filled with birds, flowers, and trees. In the middle of the valley, a silver waterfall flowed down, looking spectacular. The scene in the valley was a sharp contrast to the scene of the island outside. In this valley that was like spring all year round, there were caves of different shapes and sizes. Zhuowen stood at the entrance with the corners of his mouth slightly raised. How could he not see that the reason why this valley was different was because there was some kind of restriction set up in this valley? The jade talisman stopped at the entrance of the valley. To be more precise, it was blocked outside the restriction. Brother Zhuo, there's a restriction here. What should we do? Xiao Lang looked at Zhuowen and asked, "Don't worry, I'll take care of this restriction." As Zhuowen spoke, he waved his sleeve and summoned the beast bone array disc. At the same time, his right hand formed seals again and again, looking quite unfathomable. The restriction in the valley wasn't very strong. It was only a level 5 great array. Moreover, it didn't have any defensive effect. There wasn't even a monitoring array inside. It was obvious that the purpose of the person who set up the array was only to improve the environment in the valley. Not long after, Zhuowen opened a small gap on the edge of the restriction, just enough for one person to pass through. "Now it's done, let's go in." Zhuowen smiled and took the lead to follow the jade talisman into the restriction. Although the valley was large, there weren't many cave dwellings inside. There were only about 50 to 60 of them, which meant that there were at least 50 to 60 cultivators in this valley. Although the number wasn't many, compared to the first island where Xiao Lang and the others were, this place was much more lively. Moreover, these cave dwellings were basically closed. It was obvious that most of the cultivators inside were in a state of seclusion. Whiz! The jade talisman instantly flew out and flew towards the cave dwellings in the center. Finally, it stopped in front of a cave dwelling that was shaped like a bamboo house. The instant the jade talisman stopped in front of the bamboo house, the restriction on the surface of the bamboo house was opened. A gray-clothed woman walked out from inside. This gray-clothed woman's figure was slightly bloated, and there were some freckles on her face. Although she wasn't ugly, she wasn't good-looking either. She could only be considered a very ordinary woman. The gray-clothed woman clearly intended to go out. However, when her gaze fell on the jade talisman in front of the door, she was immediately stunned. Immediately after, the gray-clothed woman turned her head and finally noticed Zhuowen and the other three. Of course, the gray-clothed woman's gaze was mostly on Xiao Lang and the other two. As for Zhuowen, it was her first time seeing him. "Xiao Lang, Xiao Yin, and Xiao Fu, you're finally here." The gray-clothed woman's eyes revealed a look of joy. She hurriedly stepped forward and sized up Xiao Lang and the other two. Moreover, she chatted with the three of them. After the four of them chatted for a while, Xiao Lang pointed at Zhuowen beside him and said, "Junior sister Ruqing, this is Zhuowen." This time, the three of us were able to enter the second island, thanks to brother Zhuowen. The gray-clothed woman looked at Zhuowen in surprise. Soon after, she chuckled and revealed an indifferent expression. She casually said to Zhuowen, "Thank you for your help, brother. Otherwise, I don't know when I would be able to see the three of them again." Zhuowen nodded and didn't say anything. He could tell from the gray-clothed woman's eyes that she didn't believe that he had brought Xiao Lang and the other two here. Xiao Lang felt a little awkward. Just as he was about to explain, Zhuowen's eyes indicated that he didn't need to say anything. Zhuowen's signal with his eyes was naturally seen by the gray-clothed woman. The gray-clothed woman took this signal as an embarrassing action of the white-clothed young man in front of her after his lie was seen through. She felt a little contempt in her heart. The gray-clothed woman's reaction was mainly due to the fact that Zhuowen's aura was too weak. It was only at the 7th level of the illusory sky realm. This was also the reason why the gray-clothed woman had a preconceived notion that the white-clothed young man before her was definitely not strong enough. Chapter 2334. Tang Ruching. When you entered the island, you should have been registered, right? I believe you will soon be assigned cave residences. The gray-robed woman looked at Xiao Lang and the others. Registered? No, we came in directly. We didn't meet anyone on the way, Xiao Lang said in surprise. The gray-robed woman frowned slightly and said, How is that possible? There are always 2 guards at the end of the bridge. When you entered the island, you were recorded by those 2 guards. How is it possible that you didn't meet them? Xiao Lang spread his hands and said, We did see 2 cave residences at the end of the bridge. However, there was no one there, so we came in by ourselves. The gray-robed woman pondered for a moment and sighed softly. You can stay in my cave residence first. Since the guards aren't here, something might have happened. I will go and ask around. You should know that if you live on the island without being registered, you will easily be treated as an alien. At that time, other cultivators on the island will denounce you. Xiao Lang and the others looked at each other and nodded seriously. After all, the gray-robed woman was so cautious that she obviously didn't deceive them. Under the gray-robed woman's lead, the 4 of them entered her cave residence. Through the conversation between the gray-robed woman and Xiao Lang, Zhuowen learned that the gray-robed woman's name was Tang Ruching. She was also a rogue cultivator. Her cultivation was at the early stage of the Void Heaven 8 step, but her refining skills were well known throughout the 6 Desires heavenly domain. Zhuowen knew that Tang Ruching didn't have a good impression of him because of Xiao Lang's words at the beginning, so he didn't say much. Tang Ruching was obviously not an unreasonable woman. When she found that Zhuowen was silent, her tone softened a lot, and she didn't show the disdain she had at the beginning. Tang Ruching's cave residence was very large. There were 7 or 8 rooms inside, and most of them were refining materials. She casually tidied up and chose 4 rooms for Zhuowen, Xiao Lang, and the others to live in. By the way, since the 4 of you passed the 2nd checkpoint, you should have a corresponding reward. Do you want to go to the center of the island with me to receive the reward? Tang Ruching looked at Zhuowen and the others and asked, That's good too. If we can obtain rare materials, I hope you can help us a little, Xiao Lang said with a smile. Tang Ruching smiled and said, There's no need to say such things between friends. By the way, Miss Tang, the 4 of us are unfamiliar faces. When we go out, I'm afraid we'll be recognized by others. Zhuowen voiced his concern. Tang Ruching smiled faintly. Don't worry. Most of the cultivators who enter this place are stubborn. All they think about is how to pass the 3rd stage. They don't have time to chat, so most of the cultivators don't know each other. Even if you are unfamiliar faces, it is impossible to arouse the suspicion of other cultivators. Moreover, most of the cultivators here are in seclusion. It will be difficult for you to meet them on the road, unless it is the guard of the bridge or that Ancestor Lu. When Tang Ruching mentioned Ancestor Lu, Zhuowen saw a hint of reverence in her eyes. It seemed that the Ancestor Lu she was talking about was not a simple person. Let's go. As long as there are no unfamiliar caves here, we won't attract the attention of others. Now, follow me to the center of the island. As Tang Ruching spoke, he led Zhuowen, Xiao Lang, and the other 2 towards the center of the island in the depths of the valley. While Tang Ruching's group of 5 were heading towards the center of the island, in the middle of the valley, there was a hidden cave dwelling hidden within the waterfall. Inside the cave, the slightly plump cultivator was trembling as he knelt on one knee. In front of him, there was a stone pillar. The top of the stone pillar was as smooth as a mirror, and a stalwart figure was sitting cross-legged on it. Beside the stone pillar, a beautiful figure suddenly stood there without saying a word. What happened at the bridge? The stalwart figure, sitting cross-legged on the stone pillar, was a rather young man. He had a pair of beautiful phoenix eyes, red lips, and white teeth. He was a rare, handsome man. The slightly plump cultivator hurriedly said, "Ancestor Lou, it's actually like this. Judith and I have always been dutifully guarding the bridge. But today I discovered that there were terrifying battle fluctuations coming from the other side of the bridge. The entire bridge was shaking. In order to find out the reason, and for the safety of the other fellow Taoists on the island, we risked our lives to see what was going on in front of the bridge. We didn't go far before we saw a challenger fighting with Sam. After all, we are fellow Taoists. When the challenger was fighting with Sam, we were quite worried. We were eager to save people, so we went to help. However, Sam was too powerful. Not only did he injure me, Judith also died." At this point, the slightly plump cultivator didn't continue. He knew that there was no need to say what happened next. Ancestor Lou had more or less guessed it. "What form is Sam in?" Ancestor Lou asked indifferently. The slightly plump cultivator's eyes flickered as he forced a smile and said, "It's in the form of an animal." However, before he could finish his words, he was struck in the chest by a huge force and was sent flying, crashing into the rock wall behind him. "If Sam was in the form of an animal, would you be so afraid?" Ancestor Lou said indifferently. The slightly plump cultivator hurriedly knelt down and said, "Ancestor Lou is indeed perceptive. Sam is in human form." "What happened to the challenger?" Ancestor Lou asked with interest. "This subordinate ran away, but before I left, Sam completely suppressed the challenger. I'm afraid it's over." The slightly plump cultivator said cautiously. Ancestor Lou nodded. He had experienced how strong Sam was in human form. If he hadn't been lucky enough at that time, he might have died at Sam's hands. Ancestor Lou was quite interested that the challenger could attract the attention of Sam in human form. As for whether that cultivator could also defeat Sam in human form, he also felt that it was very unlikely. "You can leave. I won't nominate any more guards for the bridge," Ancestor Lou said rather heroically. The slightly plump cultivator trembled. He looked up at the man on the stone pillar excitedly and said, "Ancestor Lou, could it be that you—" "Yes, I'm coming out of seclusion." Ancestor Lou smiled faintly and slowly stood up with his hands behind his back. There was a soul-stirring aura lingering around his body. "Congratulations, Ancestor Lou." The slightly plump cultivator hurriedly bowed on the ground and then left the cave abode with excitement. The slightly plump cultivator knew very well what it meant for Ancestor Lou to come out of seclusion. It meant that he was going to challenge the third level. Moreover, Ancestor Lou had said that if he came out of seclusion, he would lead the cultivators on the island to the third island. He would never go back on his words. It was precisely because of Ancestor Lou's promise and the fact that he was indeed the most talented cultivator on this island and had the deepest understanding of space-time law that the cultivators on the island unanimously regarded him as their leader. Moreover, most of the cultivators' resources were given to Ancestor Lou so that he could quickly comprehend the power of space-time law. If he could create a space-time law ability, it would naturally be best. Ancestor Lou carried the high hopes of many cultivators on the island for the arrival of this day.